Hey guys! Tonight we're taking a journey back in time, way back, to an era where life wasn't about Wi-Fi signals and avocado toast, but about the very dirt beneath your calloused feet and the constant gnawing fear of an empty stomach. Imagine standing knee-deep in a muddy field, the wind whipping past, smelling of damp earth and something vaguely unpleasant from the pigsty nearby. The sun, if it even bothers to show its face, offers little warmth. You're shivering. Your stomach growls a protest, and you know tomorrow will be just like today, only colder, maybe hungrier. You're a medieval peasant, and frankly, you probably won't survive this. But hey, that's what makes it interesting. Right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the early medieval period, perhaps the 11th or 12th century, dropped right into the thick of it. No comfy armchair, no smartphone, just you, your threadbare tunic, and a profound sense of what on earth am I going to eat today. Your entire existence revolves around the land. This isn't some romanticized, pastoral dream. This is hard, back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. Every sunrise demands your attention, pulling you from your straw-filled cot, urging you towards the fields that are both your provider and your tormentor. You understand, deep in your bones, that the very fabric of your life, the lives of your family, depends entirely on the capricious whims of nature and the fertile ground beneath your bare feet. This isn't just about planting a few seeds and hoping for the best. You're part of an intricate, unwritten contract with the earth. You meticulously prepare the soil, often using an ard, a simple, scratch plough that barely turns the earth. Certainly not flipping it over like modern ploughs do. It's more like a giant stick dragged through the dirt. You sow seeds by hand, scattering them with a practiced flick of the wrist, hoping the birds don't get to them before they can sprout. Then you wait and worry. The growing season is a constant vigil against frost, drought, too much rain, too little rain, and every insect and creature that fancies your meager crop for their next meal. Historians still argue whether the switch to heavier wheeled ploughs in some regions truly led to a medieval agricultural revolution, or if it was a more gradual evolution over centuries. But for you, the individual peasant, it just meant a slightly different way to get dirt under your fingernails. You live in a manor, a self-sufficient economic and social unit centered around the lord's estate. This isn't just a village, it's an ecosystem of power and necessity. You, the peasant, are at the very bottom of this hierarchy, tied to the land, often as a serf. This isn't quite slavery, but it's not freedom either. You can't just pack up your muddy boots and leave. You're bound to the manor, to the land, and to the lord who owns it. Your life, from birth to death, is dictated by the rhythms of this agricultural cycle and the demands of your overlord. Think of it like a subscription service you can never cancel. Even when the content is pretty dire, your small plot of land, typically a few acres in scattered strips across the open fields, isn't truly yours. You merely have the right to work it in exchange for labor and payments to the lord. This is a mainstream historical fact. The vast majority of the population in medieval Europe were peasants, primarily involved in subsistence farming. Your entire worldview stretches little further than the boundaries of your village, maybe the nearest market town if you're lucky enough to visit once in a while. News travels slowly, distorted by rumor and superstition. The biggest quirky tidbit of your life might be that time a wandering minstrel passed through, telling tales of far-off lands and mythical beasts, or perhaps the strange, almost magical, appearance of a new kind of turnip that promises a better yield. You hold on to these small moments, these brief glimpses beyond your toil, because they are rare and precious. The threat of famine, plague, or the Lord's ire hangs over you constantly. These aren't abstract concepts, they are imminent dangers. As real as the ache in your back at the end of a long day, your survival is a testament to sheer grit, a reliance on your community, and a quiet, often desperate, hope for the next harvest. You live on the edge. Always one bad season, one outbreak of illness, or one tyrannical demand from the Lord, and your fragile existence could shatter. Welcome to your life. Now, about those weeds, as you wipe the sweat from your brow, the sun glinting off the newly turned earth. Your thoughts inevitably turn to the very foundation of your existence, the fallow field. It might sound counterintuitive to leave a perfectly good field unplanted, but in the medieval agricultural system, this was not just common practice, it was absolutely essential for survival. Imagine a modern farmer scoffing at the idea of leaving a portion of their valuable land unused. Yet, for you, it's a profound, almost sacred cycle. You understand, perhaps instinctively, that the soil is not an endless giver. It needs rest. It needs rejuvenation. This fallow period, typically every third year in the widespread three-field system, allowed the exhausted land to recover some of its vital nutrients. Without it, your already meager yields would plummet even further, leading to inevitable starvation. You're acutely aware of the soil's temperament. You've seen fields that have been pushed too hard, their earth turning pale and stubborn, refusing to yield a decent crop. This fallow land is a promise of future sustenance, a quiet hope that next year, this particular patch will reward your efforts. It's a gamble, of course, because every unplanted acre means less food now, less grain for your family, less to pay to the Lord, but the alternative is worse, a completely barren future. Historians still argue whether the three-field system was truly an innovation or a logical adaptation that simply became more widespread. But for you, it's just how things are done. You learn it from your elders, watching them carefully divide the village's vast open fields into three great sections, one for winter crops like wheat or rye, one for spring crops like oats or barley, and one, crucially, left to lie fallow. The fallow field isn't entirely idle, though sometimes it serves as pasture for the village livestock, your scrawny cow, a few sheep, or the Lord's pigs. Their droppings, while undeniably pungent, provide much-needed manure, helping to fertilize the soil naturally. This integrated system of crops and animals is a quirky tidbit of medieval farming that really highlights the ingenuity born of necessity. You don't have access to chemical fertilizers, so every scrap of organic matter is precious. You might even spend a day, when you're not tilling or sowing, carefully spreading dung across the fallow ground, the smell clinging to your clothes long after you've returned to your hovel. It's dirty, it's smelly, but it's life. This reliance on the land, and the limited understanding of soil science, means that crop rotation is less about specific nutrient management and more about giving the land a break. You can't tell me the precise nitrogen content or phosphate levels, you just know if the earth looks tired. The weather, that ever-present and uncontrollable force, dictates everything. A late spring frost can decimate your newly sprouted crops, while a long, dry summer can shrivel them in the fields. You live with a constant, low-level anxiety about the sky, scanning the clouds for signs of rain, or perhaps dreading the onset of a prolonged downpour that could rot everything in the ground. The promise of the fallow field is a delicate one, always subject to external pressures. Your Lord, for instance, might demand more grain, pushing you to plant more intensely, leaving less land fallow, ultimately risking future harvests. Or perhaps the village itself grows, and the pressure to feed more mouths leads to the desperate decision to reduce the fallow period. Every choice in this agricultural dance is a high-stakes gamble. You rely on generations of accumulated wisdom, passed down through weary hands and whispered warnings. There are no agricultural colleges, no scientific journals, just the hard-won experience of your ancestors etched into the very soil you work. You trudge home as dusk settles, your muscles aching, your thoughts still on the fields. The smell of wood smoke hangs heavy in the air, a comforting sign that others are also preparing their meager evening meal. The fallow field, dark and silent under the stars, waits patiently for its turn. A testament to a cycle of scarcity and fragile renewal that defines your entire existence. It's a quiet hope in a world of endless toil, a silent prayer for a better tomorrow. And sometimes, just sometimes, that prayer is answered. After a day spent coaxing life from the stubborn earth, your thoughts narrow to the most immediate, pressing concern, the next meal, and for you, a medieval peasant. This almost invariably means daily bread and porridge. You don't have the luxury of choice, of browsing aisles filled with exotic fruits and prepackaged meals. Your diet is a relentless, monotonous cycle of grains, and if you're lucky, a few seasonal vegetables. This is the bedrock of your survival, the fuel for your endless labor, and the ever-present subject of your anxieties. Imagine the smell of wood smoke and damp straw as you step into your hovel. Your mother, or perhaps your wife, is already tending the small, open fire in the center of the hut. A simple clay pot hangs over the flames, bubbling with what will become tonight's dinner. It's almost certainly porridge, made from barley, oats, or rye, whichever grain was most abundant from the last harvest. It's thick, often bland, and utterly essential. This isn't the creamy, sweet oatmeal you might enjoy with berries and honey. This is sustenance, pure and unadorned. Sometimes, if you're truly fortunate, a few foraged greens or a turnip might be thrown in, adding a whisper of flavour and a fleeting hint of vitamins. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly ate as little meat as commonly believed, or if their diet was slightly more varied due to hunting and poaching. But for the vast majority, grain was king. Bread, too, is a staple, but it's not the light, airy loaf you find in a modern bakery. It's dense, dark, and coarse, often mixed with other flours or even ground acorns when times are tough. You probably bake it in a communal oven in the village, a shared resource that highlights the communal nature of peasant life. The ritual of grinding grain, kneading dough, and baking bread is a daily sacrament, a testament to your unyielding struggle against hunger. Every crumb is precious. You wouldn't dream of wasting a single morsel. A quirky tidbit about medieval bread is that often it was so hard and stale, particularly in noble households, that it was used as trenchers, edible plates upon which meat and other foods were served, soaking up the juices, and then often given to the poor or dogs afterwards. For you, though your bread is simply food, to be cherished, meat is a rare luxury, perhaps a scrawny chicken on a feast day, or a piece of tough salt pork if your lord has been generous or you've managed to snare a rabbit from the woods. A risky endeavour, as poaching on the lord's land could mean severe punishment. Fish, if you live near a river or pond, might offer another occasional protein source. Dairy, from your single cow, might provide some milk or cheese. But most of it is often owed to the lord or saved for special occasions. Vegetables, such as cabbages, onions, carrots, and peas, are grown in your small garden plot next to your hovel, but their seasonality means they're not always available. Fruit is typically foraged, wild berries or apples, and eaten fresh when ripe. The constant threat of hunger, or what was called famine, is a shadow that never truly leaves you. One bad harvest, one prolonged drought, one unusually harsh winter, and the delicate balance between subsistence and starvation tips precariously. You learn to live with a chronic emptiness in your stomach, a perpetual low-level hunger that dulls your senses but sharpens your instinct for survival. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a constant, visceral reminder of your vulnerability. You understand that your diet, while monotonous, is precisely calibrated to provide just enough energy for your demanding physical labor. Anything less, and you falter. The scarcity of food also means that food preservation is rudimentary. You dry grains, salt what little meat you acquire, and store root vegetables in cool, dark places. But spoilage is rampant. You don't have refrigerators or freezers. Every effort is made to maximize every caloric intake. Even the pigs, often considered part of the family, are sometimes seen as potential food, a difficult choice that highlights the desperation of your circumstances. Eating is not a pleasure, it is a necessity, a constant battle won one meagre spoonful at a time. As the last bit of porridge is scraped from the pot, you know the cycle begins anew tomorrow. Having scraped the last vestiges of porridge from your bowl, you retire to your dwelling, which for you, a medieval peasant, is less a home and more a rudimentary shelter. These are your huts of mud and wattle, and they are a far cry from anything you'd consider comfortable or even particularly hygienic. Imagine a small, dark, single-room structure, perhaps 10 by 15 feet, built from whatever materials are readily available, a timber frame, walls woven from branches, wattle, and plastered with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, daub. The roof is thatched with straw or reeds, thick enough to offer some protection from rain, but not much else. Stepping inside, you're immediately struck by the dimness. There are no glass windows, just small, unglazed openings, if any, that let in a trickle of light but also the biting wind and driving rain. Most of the time, the only real light comes from the flickering flames of the central hearth. This open fire is essential for cooking and providing what little warmth there is, but it also fills the air with constant smoke, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Your lungs are likely accustomed to it, but the chronic cough it causes is a familiar companion. This lack of proper ventilation is a mainstream historical fact, contributing significantly to respiratory illnesses among peasants. The floor is bare earth, often damp and cold, sometimes covered with a scattering of straw that quickly becomes matted with dirt and refuse. There's no furniture to speak of, maybe a rough wooden bench or a stool if you're lucky. Your bed is a pile of straw, perhaps on a raised platform to keep it off the cold ground, shared with your family. Privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist. Everyone sleeps in the same room, often huddled together for warmth, and sometimes you're not alone. This brings us to a rather unsavory but utterly practical aspect of your life. Your hut is often shared with your livestock. A scrawny cow, a pig, perhaps a few chickens might live alongside you, especially during the colder months. This is a quirky tidbit that might make modern sensibilities recoil, but for you, it makes perfect sense. The animals provide extra warmth from their body heat. Their presence deters thieves, and it keeps them safe from wolves or other predators. Of course, it also means that the smell of animal and human waste, damp earth, and wood smoke is the pervasive aroma of your daily existence. Historians still argue whether this practice was universal or more common in certain regions. But the logic of shared shelter in a harsh climate is undeniable. Cleanliness, as you know it, is a luxury. You wash infrequently, perhaps in a nearby stream or with a bucket of cold water. Soap is rare and expensive. Fleas, lice, and other vermin are an unavoidable part of life, constant companions on your skin and in your hair. Disease spreads rapidly in these cramped, unhygienic conditions. A cough in one corner of the hut can quickly turn into a full-blown fever for the entire family. The concept of germ theory is millennia away. You attribute illness to bad air, divine displeasure, or malevolent spirits. Despite the harshness, this hut is your sanctuary, your only protection from the elements and the dangers of the night. It's where your family gathers, where stories are told by firelight, and where generations live and die. It's a testament to resilience, a pragmatic solution to the fundamental need for shelter. You might grumble about the smoke or the draft, but you understand its vital role in your survival. And as you lie down on your straw bed, listening to the gentle snuffles of your cow in the corner, you pull your coarse blanket tighter, hoping for enough warmth to make it through another night. In the cramped confines of your mud and wattle hut, surrounded by the familiar smells of smoke and straw, you learn quickly that survival isn't a solitary endeavor, it's a collective effort. Powered by the very core unit of your society, your family. This isn't just about emotional bonds, it's about a literal, unbreakable partnership in labor and a desperate hope for legacy. Your family is your workforce, your support system, and your only real safety net in a world that offers precious few. From the moment you are old enough to grasp a tool, you are expected to contribute. There's no concept of childhood as a period of carefree play and learning. Every pair of hands, no matter how small, is a valuable asset. Young children might be tasked with scaring birds from the crops, gathering firewood, or fetching water from the communal well. As you grow, your responsibilities increase. Boys follow their fathers into the fields, learning the rhythms of ploughing, sowing, and harvesting. Girls learn from their mothers the skills of the household, preparing food, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, making and mending clothes, and tending to the small garden plot outside the hovel. This division of labour, though seemingly rigid, ensures that every aspect of the household economy is covered. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval peasant families were large, extended units where multiple generations lived and worked together, all contributing to the household's survival. Imagine your eldest brother, already strong for his age, yoked to the plough alongside your father, their grunts echoing in the morning air. Or your younger sister, meticulously picking lice from your mother's hair by the firelight, a grim but common bonding activity. Every chore, no matter how mundane, serves a direct purpose in the family's survival. There are no idle hands. The elderly, even when their strength wanes, contribute by mending tools, looking after younger children, or sharing their invaluable wisdom about farming practices and weather patterns, knowledge that has been accumulated over generations. Historians still argue whether the concept of a nuclear family, as we understand it, existed in the same way in the medieval period, or if the extended family and village community were far more intertwined and indistinguishable in their functions. For you, it just is what it is. The family also provides a crucial sense of security. In a world without social welfare programs, hospitals, or police forces, your kin are the only ones you can truly rely on. If you fall ill, your family tends to you. If a crop fails, your family shares what little food remains. If you face a dispute with a neighbour or the Lord's bailiff, your family stands with you, perhaps offering moral support or even physical defence. A quirky tidbit about family life is that godparents often played a significant role, providing an additional layer of social and spiritual support, sometimes even caring for children if their biological parents died. This wasn't just a religious formality, it was a practical expansion of the safety net. Children are not just extra mouths to feed, they are the future workforce, the inheritors of the land, and the continuation of the family line. High infant mortality rates mean that many children do not survive to adulthood, making each healthy birth a cause for quiet celebration and an investment in the family's future. Marriage is less about romantic love and more about practical alliances, ensuring a steady supply of labour and potentially bringing in a dowry, however modest, or additional land. Your parents likely arranged your marriage, focusing on what would benefit the family's standing and economic viability. As you drift off to sleep, squeezed between your siblings, you can hear the soft breathing of your parents nearby. The smells of unwashed bodies and damp straw are comforting in their familiarity. This small, crowded space is where life unfolds, where every struggle is shared and every small victory celebrated. Your family is your rock, your refuge, and the engine that drives your endless, grinding existence. Without them, you would surely perish. With the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across your muddy track, your thoughts, like the dust you kick up with each step, inevitably drift to the inescapable figure who dictates so much of your life, the Lord of the Manor. He is the omnipresent shadow, the ultimate authority, the personification of the feudal system that governs your every waking moment. You don't interact with him daily, perhaps only seeing him on rare occasions, but his power is absolute, permeating every aspect of your existence. Imagine him residing in the manor house, a sturdy stone or timber building, vastly more comfortable than your own hovel, surrounded by a moat or palisade. From there, he exerts control over every inch of land you work and every decision you make. You are not a free individual, you are, in essence, his property, or rather, bound to his land. This is the very definition of feudalism, a system where land is exchanged for service and loyalty, with you, the peasant, at the bottom of the pyramid. This isn't just a historical fact, it's your daily reality, a heavy burden that shapes your choices. Your lord isn't necessarily evil, but he is a product of his time, driven by the need to maintain his status, wealth, and military strength. He owes loyalty and service to a higher noble, perhaps a baron or even the king, And your labor is the fundamental resource that allows him to fulfill his obligations. He controls the vast majority of the land, the mill where you grind your grain, the oven where you bake your bread, and even the forest where you might hope to forage. A quirky tidbit is that in many manors, you weren't even allowed to marry someone from outside the manor without paying a fee to your lord, known as machette. It was his way of ensuring his labor force didn't simply walk away. His power isn't just about land and resources, it's judicial. He holds the manorial court, where disputes are settled, minor crimes are punished, and fines are levied. Imagine the fear you'd feel standing before him, knowing that your fate, your property, and even your freedom could be decided by his whim. His word is law within the confines of the manor, and challenging it is a perilous undertaking, almost unthinkable for someone in your position. Historians still argue whether the Lord's power was truly as absolute in practice as it was in theory, with some suggesting that custom and community pressure often mitigated the harshest aspects of his rule. But for you, the peasant, the threat of his displeasure is very real. You owe him a complex web of duties and payments. This isn't just rent, it's a multifaceted obligation. You owe him a portion of your harvest, known as rent in kind. You owe him labor, known as corvée or boon work, typically working on his personal land, the domain, for several days a week, especially during planting and harvest times, often when you desperately need to be working your own fields. You owe him fees for using his mill, his oven, or his wine press. And then there are the less tangible demands: respect, deference, and absolute obedience. This constant giving, this perpetual servitude, defines your relationship with the Lord. You might grumble among yourselves in the privacy of your hovel, or share a wry, knowing glance with a neighbor when the bailiff collects the dues. But open defiance is rare and dangerous. Your survival hinges on maintaining a delicate balance, providing enough to satisfy the Lord, while retaining just enough for your own family to scrape by. The Lord, in turn, offers a degree of protection, perhaps from bandits or rival lords, and maintains a semblance of order. It's a harsh bargain, but one you are born into, and one you rarely have the means to escape. As you return to your field, the Lord's manor house, a distant speck on the horizon, reminds you of your place in the world, with the Lord of the manor looming large in your existence. It's inevitable that a significant portion of your hard-won produce and precious time isn't truly your own. Instead, it's claimed by an intricate web of demands, the taxes, tithes, and tallage that drain your resources and deepen your servitude. These aren't just simple payments, they are constant reminders of your subordinate status, a relentless siphoning of the very sustenance you struggle so hard to produce. Imagine the grim procession of the Lord's bailiff, or the church's collector, coming to your door. You know exactly why they're there. First, there are the rents in kind. This means you physically hand over a portion of your harvest, a percentage of your wheat, your barley, your oats, perhaps a specific number of chickens, or a certain quantity of eggs. This isn't theoretical money, it's tangible food. Removed directly from your family's dwindling larder, you watch it go, knowing that every bushel taken means a few more hungry nights for your own children. This direct payment in goods was a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the largely non-monetary economy of the early medieval period. Then there's the tithe, a church tax, typically 1/10 of your agricultural produce or income, theoretically for the support of the clergy and maintenance of the church building. You're a devout Christian, believing in the power of prayer and the salvation offered by the church, but parting with another 10th of your harvest, after the Lord has taken his share, feels like a cruel twist of the knife. It's hard to imagine, but even in your impoverished state, the church was a significant landowner and extractor of wealth. Historians still argue whether the burden of the tithe was felt more heavily than the Lord's demands, or if it was accepted more readily due to religious conviction. Either way, it was a significant drain on your household. But wait, there's more beyond these regular impositions. There's the dreaded tallage. This was an arbitrary tax, a special levy that the Lord could demand whenever he needed extra funds, perhaps for a new fortification, a war, or simply to support his extravagant lifestyle. There was no fixed amount, no real notice, and no recourse. It was simply demanded, and you had to pay. Imagine the anxiety that would grip you when rumours of a tallage spread through the village. Another layer of uncertainty piled onto an already precarious existence. A quirky tidbit is that peasants sometimes had to pay a tax called heriot upon the death of the head of the household, where the lord would take the best beast or chattel as a form of inheritance tax. It's like saying, "Thanks for all your hard work. Now we'll take your best cow," just because you died. A real medieval kick in the pants. Beyond these direct payments, there are the fees for using the lord's essential monopolies. You must take your grain to the lord's mill to be ground into flour. Paying a portion of the flour as a fee, you must use the lord's oven to bake your bread. Again paying a charge. If you need to press apples for cider or grapes for wine, you use his press and pay for the privilege. These are known as banalities, and they ensure the lord profits from every stage of your food production, even the bits you manage to keep. It's a closed system, designed to keep you beholden and dependent. The cumulative effect of these taxes, tithes, and fees is immense. You are perpetually on the verge of destitution, always giving more than you feel you can afford. This constant economic pressure means you have little opportunity to accumulate wealth, to save for a bad harvest, or to improve your own living conditions. Your life is an endless treadmill of production and extraction, all to support the layers of society above you. As you watch the cart laden with your lord's share rumble away, the stark reality of your situation settles in once more. You are not working for yourself alone, you are working for everyone else too. As if the constant drain of taxes and tithes wasn't enough, your life as a medieval peasant is further dominated by another inescapable obligation: forced labour on the domain. This isn't just about working your own small strips of land, it's about dedicating a significant portion of your precious time and energy to the lord's personal estate. Often when your own crops desperately need your attention, this system, known as corvée or boon work, is a fundamental pillar of feudalism, ensuring the lord's wealth is built directly upon your sweat and toil. Imagine the frustration. You wake before dawn, knowing your own family's survival hinges on the successful harvest of your small plot. But instead of heading to your own field, you're compelled to report to the lord's domain, his private lands that are typically the most fertile and well-maintained on the manor. For perhaps 2 or 3 days a week, or even more during peak seasons, your labour belongs entirely to him. You might be ploughing his fields, sowing his seeds, weeding his crops, or mending his fences. This is a mainstream historical fact. Peasant labour was the primary engine of the manorial economy. The timing of this forced labour is often the cruelest irony, when your own wheat is ripe for harvest, threatening to spoil if not gathered quickly. The lord's bailiff will call you to his fields first. When your hay needs cutting before the rains come, you'll be cutting the lord's hay. This means your own crops often suffer. You might have to leave them in the field longer, risking rot or predation, or work late into the night on your own land after a full day of labouring for the lord. It's a constant, nagging dilemma. Neglect your lord and face punishment, or neglect your family and face hunger. There's no easy choice. This isn't just brute force labour, it's often a highly organised, if unappreciated, effort. The bailiff, the lord's direct overseer, will direct your tasks, ensuring maximum efficiency for the lord. That is, you might be working alongside dozens of other peasants from your village, a silent camaraderie born of shared hardship. A quirky tidbit is that specific boon works were often tied to particular seasons or tasks, like harvest boon or ploughing boon, indicating exactly what labour the lord could demand at a given time. These weren't just vague requests, they were specific, customary obligations passed down through generations. The lord's rationale is simple. He provides the land you live on, and in return, you provide the labour to sustain him. This arrangement, however, often felt deeply unfair to the peasant. While the lord might offer a meal or some ale during intense work periods like harvest, it was a meagre offering compared to the value of the labour extracted. Historians still argue whether peasants grudgingly accepted these obligations as part of the natural order or constantly sought ways to minimize their work for the Lord. You certainly don't sing joyfully as you toil on his land, you simply do what is required to avoid dire consequences. The alternative to performing these labor services was often to pay a fine or commute the service into a monetary payment, but for most peasants, money was scarce. So, you wield your hoe, push your plow, or swing your sickle, knowing that every swing benefits someone else more than it benefits you. The sun beats down, the sweat stings your eyes, and the endless rows of the Lord's crops stretch out before you. This forced labor is not merely an inconvenience, it's a profound limitation on your personal autonomy. A daily reminder that your body, your time, and your effort are not entirely your own. And as the day ends and you finally trudge towards your own neglected fields, the exhaustion in your bones is a testament to the unyielding demands of your feudal lord, beyond the grueling labor and the relentless demands on your harvest. The Lord's power extends into every crack and crevice of your life, especially when it comes to resolving disputes and maintaining order. This is where you encounter the justice in the manorial court, a place where the Lord's word is law, and your understanding of fairness is often put to the test. This court isn't some grand, imposing building, it's usually held in the Lord's Hall, or even outdoors under a significant tree, but its impact on your life is profound. Imagine the scene. You stand nervously before the Lord or his steward, perhaps accused of allowing your pig to stray into a neighbor's field, or perhaps you're seeking redress because a fellow peasant damaged your meager fence. The air is thick with tension, there are no lawyers, no complex legal statutes as you might imagine them today. Justice is administered swiftly, often based on custom. The Lord's interpretation and the testimony of your fellow villagers. This immediate, localized form of justice is a mainstream historical fact, fundamental to the running of any medieval manor. It's an interesting contrast to modern legal systems, where the state holds ultimate judicial authority. The manorial court deals with a wide array of petty offences and local matters, boundary disputes, straying livestock, minor assaults, failure to perform labour services, and even disputes over inheritance all fall under its purview. The penalties are usually fines, paid in cash or in kind, perhaps a chicken or a measure of grain, or sometimes public humiliation. Imprisonment is rare. As keeping prisoners is expensive and labour-intensive for the Lord, what he wants is compliance and revenue. A quirky tidbit is that women often had a surprising amount of voice in these courts, sometimes even acting as jurors or prosecuting cases related to domestic disputes or slander. It wasn't equality, but it was more agency than many might assume, for you, the peasant. The court is a place of both fear and necessity. You fear it because the Lord's judgment can be arbitrary. He might favour a richer peasant, or a relative of his bailiff. There's no appeal system as you'd understand it. His decision is final. You also need it, however, because it's the only mechanism for resolving conflicts within the village. Without it, disagreements could fester into violent feuds, disrupting the fragile peace necessary for everyone to survive. It's a crude system, often swayed by influence or personal whim, but it provides a framework for order. Historians still argue whether these courts were primarily instruments of oppression, designed to extract fines and reinforce feudal control, or if they genuinely served a vital function in maintaining communal harmony and protecting peasant rights within the manorial system. For you, it's a bit of both. The court also serves a critical function for the Lord, collecting fines. Every infringement, every petty quarrel, every failure to meet an obligation results in a fine. This provides a steady, if unpredictable, stream of income for the Lord, bolstering his coffers. He isn't interested in your well-being so much as he is in your productivity and your obedience. The threat of the court and its potential financial penalties serves as a powerful deterrent, ensuring you think twice before crossing a neighbour or, more importantly, crossing the Lord. As you leave the makeshift courtroom, whether victorious or burdened by a new fine, the lessons are clear. You learn to walk carefully, to choose your words wisely, and to avoid attracting the Lord's attention unnecessarily. Your survival depends not just on your physical strength in the fields, but on your cunning and caution within this intricate, sometimes unfair, system of justice. The manorial court is a constant reminder that even in the smallest matters, your Lord holds the ultimate power over your medieval life. living under the constant thumb of your lord, enduring the heavy burden of taxes, labor, and arbitrary justice. A simmering resentment can often brew beneath the surface of peasant life. While rare, there are moments when this quiet discontent boils over, giving rise to whispers of rebellion. These aren't just casual complaints, these are desperate, often suicidal, acts of defiance against an overwhelming power, almost always with severe and brutal consequences. Imagine the hushed conversations after a particularly harsh demand from the bailiff, or after a communal grievance at the manorial court. Perhaps the lord has enclosed common land, preventing your livestock from grazing, or he's demanded an unprecedented tallage that threatens to starve your family. These injustices, layered one upon another, can push even the most resigned peasant to the brink. While individual acts of defiance might include poaching or shirking labor, outright rebellion means collective action, a dangerous gamble against a well-armed and organized authority. This is a mainstream historical fact, despite their overwhelming disadvantage. Peasant revolts, though infrequent, did occur across medieval Europe. One of the most famous examples, though still far in your future if you're in the early medieval period, is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. Imagine the sheer audacity, thousands of common folk, armed with whatever tools they could find, scythes, pitchforks, clubs, marching on London to demand an end to serfdom and oppressive taxes. This was not a localized skirmish, it was a mass uprising, fueled by economic hardship, the aftermath of the Black Death, which we'll get to soon, and deep-seated grievances against the ruling class. A quirky tidbit about this revolt is that one of their key demands was often no lord but God, illustrating a profound rejection of the feudal hierarchy itself. A radical idea for the time. The consequences of such rebellions were almost universally catastrophic for the peasants involved, even if they achieved some initial gains or concessions. The retaliation was swift and brutal once the ruling class regrouped. Leaders were captured and executed, often publicly and gruesomely. To serve as a chilling example, the initial demands were frequently revoked, and the peasants found themselves in an even worse position than before, burdened by new fines and stricter controls. Historians still argue whether these revolts were ultimately futile gestures of desperation or if they, over the long term, contributed to the gradual decline of serfdom by forcing lords to reconsider their harshest demands. For you, living through it. The immediate outlook is grim. You might hear tales of past revolts, whispered around the communal fire, cautionary tales, designed to instill fear and obedience. The memory of villagers hanged from trees, or burnt out of their homes, serves as a powerful deterrent. Yet, the desperation can sometimes outweigh the fear, the feeling that you have nothing left to lose, that starvation or injustice will claim you anyway, can spark a terrifying courage. You might not actively participate in a rebellion, but you feel the tremors, the tension in the air, the desperate hope that flickers briefly before it is usually extinguished. The power dynamic is overwhelmingly against you. The Lord has knights, soldiers, and the backing of the king. You have your tools and your numbers, but little training or coordination. The whispers of rebellion are therefore often just that, whispers. A collective sigh of frustration, a shared moment of silent anger, rather than an open, organized uprising. Yet, these suppressed feelings contribute to the long, slow-grinding pressure that will eventually, over centuries, lead to fundamental changes in society. For now, however, the Lord's authority remains unchallenged by overt revolt, and you return to your toil, the quiet hum of discontent the only sound breaking the rhythm of your work, just as you settle into the predictable, if harsh, rhythm of peasant life, the fields, the Lord, the constant hunger. An unseen horror begins its relentless march across the known world. One day, the whispers start, carried by terrified travelers and merchants from distant lands. These aren't rumors of war or famine, but something far more insidious, something that defies understanding. Then, inevitably, it arrives. This is the moment when the Black Death arrives, shattering the very fabric of your medieval existence and plunging the world into an unimaginable nightmare. And imagine the year is 1347, or perhaps a year or two later. Depending on your village's location, news travels slowly in your isolated world. But the fear travels faster than any horse. You hear stories of entire towns wiped out in Sicily, of ships arriving in ports with dead sailors at the oars, their bodies covered in gruesome swellings. At first, it's just a terrifying tale, something that happens over there. But then, the first person in your own village falls ill. Perhaps it's a merchant who recently visited a nearby town, or a distant relative who came to stay. The symptoms are horrifyingly distinct and swift. This sudden, overwhelming plague, later identified as the bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is a mainstream historical fact that reshaped Europe. The plague doesn't just spread from person to person, it's carried by fleas, which infest rats. And these rats are everywhere, in your straw-filled hovels, in the granaries, scurrying through the village streets. When the rats die, the fleas jump to the nearest warm body, which is often yours. You have no concept of germ theory, no understanding of microscopic organisms. All you know is that people are getting sick and dying with terrifying speed, often within days of the first symptoms appearing. You might attribute it to God's wrath, or poisoned air, or perhaps a malevolent spirit. But whatever the cause, its effects are undeniably real and terrifying. The speed of its spread is a horrifying aspect. One day, your neighbor is healthy, perhaps complaining of a mild fever. The next, they are covered in black boils, racked with pain, and within hours, they are gone. Then their entire family falls ill. This rapid succession of deaths creates an overwhelming sense of helplessness and panic. People are dying too fast to be properly buried, too numerous to count. The traditional rituals of mourning and burial break down under the sheer volume of corpses. A quirky tidbit is that people often carried posies of flowers or aromatic herbs, thinking that the sweet smells would ward off the bad air, miasma, that they believed caused the disease. Little did they know. They were probably just carrying more fleas. The arrival of the plague brings with it a terrifying shift in your daily routine. The fields, which were once the focus of your every waking hour, suddenly seem irrelevant. The Lord's demands become secondary to the desperate need to survive. To avoid contagion, fear becomes the dominant emotion. You might try to isolate your family, avoiding contact with others, but in your close-knit village, that's almost impossible. Funerals, normally communal events, become dangerous gatherings. The very social bonds that previously sustained you now become potential vectors for death. As the death toll mounts, the initial shock gives way to a grim resignation, or sometimes frantic despair. Some might flee, abandoning their homes and fields in a desperate attempt to outrun the unseen killer, only to carry the plague with them to new, unsuspecting communities. Others retreat into fervent prayer, believing only divine intervention can save them. The world, as you know it, is not just changing, it is collapsing around you. One agonizing death at a time. The sound of church bells, once a comfort, now tolls incessantly, marking the passage of countless souls. Once the Black Death has arrived in your village, the initial shock quickly gives way to a grim, horrifying familiarity with its terrifying physical manifestations. You become an unwilling expert in the symptoms and superstitions surrounding this invisible killer, witnessing firsthand the agonizing decline of your neighbors, friends, and family. It's a macabre education, etched into your memory with every gasped breath and every darkening lesion. Imagine seeing the first signs, a sudden, intense fever, chills, and an overwhelming weakness that forces the strongest man to his bed. Then come the characteristic swellings, or buboes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. These are painful. Egg-sized lumps that often turn black, a horrifying visual marker of the disease's progression. These buboes, from which the term bubonic plague derives, are a mainstream historical fact. The most common and recognizable symptom as the disease advances. Purple or black spots might appear on the skin, caused by internal bleeding, giving the plague its dreadful name, the Black Death. Some victims also develop a cough, spitting blood, indicating the pneumonic form of the plague. which is even more terrifying as it can spread directly from person to person through the air. You watch, helpless, as the victim writhes in agony. Delirious, their body ravaged by an enemy no one understands. The stench of sickness fills the small hovel. Desperate, people turn to anything, no matter how outlandish, for a cure. Superstitions abound, born from fear and ignorance. You might see people carrying strong-smelling herbs or flowers, not just for the bad air as mentioned before, but also to ward off evil spirits, believing the plague is a demonic affliction. Some might try bloodletting, convinced that draining bad humours from the body will restore balance, a practice that more often than not weakens the already fragile patient. A quirky tidbit is the belief that placing live chickens or pigeons on the buboes could draw out the disease, or that rubbing a patient with a live frog would absorb the sickness. Imagine the desperate scenes. People frantically trying these bizarre remedies as their loved ones slipped away. Others turn to frantic religious devotion, believing the plague is divine punishment for human sin. Processions of flagellants, who whip themselves publicly as penance, might pass through your village. Their self-inflicted wounds a testament to their desperate plea for God's mercy. Prayers are offered incessantly, candles are lit, and pilgrimages, despite the risk of spreading the disease further, are undertaken by those who can still walk. The church bells toll day and night, a constant, mournful soundtrack to the mounting death toll. The lack of medical understanding is profound. There are no doctors in your village, only perhaps a local healer who relies on traditional remedies, often based on herbs or basic empirical knowledge. They are as helpless as you are against this invisible scourge. Attempts to understand the disease are limited to explanations like miasma, bad air, or a misalignment of planets. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in divine punishment for sin led to a greater sense of community and shared suffering, or if it instead fostered an atmosphere of panic, scapegoating, and moral decay, with people turning on outsiders or those perceived as sinners. As the days turn into weeks, the sight of the dying becomes tragically common. You see the signs in the eyes of your neighbours, the telltale lethargy, the fear, and then the buboes. Your only hope is that you or your loved ones are spared, a hope that dwindles with each passing funeral bell. The memory of the agonizing symptoms, the desperate, futile cures, and the omnipresent smell of sickness will forever be burned into your senses. A grim reminder of humanity's fragility, as the Black Death rampages through your village. The agonizing symptoms and futile remedies are just the prelude to the overwhelming reality of its true devastation. Mass graves and empty villages. The sheer volume of death is something your world, accustomed to a harsh but predictable cycle of life and death, has never before witnessed. Life doesn't just slow down, it grinds to a terrifying halt. Imagine the scene. One day, the church bells toll for a single soul. The next, they chime 3 times. Soon, they are ringing almost continuously, a mournful, relentless chorus marking the passage of countless lives. The traditional practices of burial, which are so important for honouring the dead and maintaining social order, simply break down. There isn't enough time, enough healthy hands, or even enough consecrated ground to bury everyone individually. This desperate need for efficient disposal leads to the grim necessity of mass graves. Your community, which once mourned its dead with solemn dignity, now has to dig vast pits, into which bodies are hastily placed, often without shrouds or prayers. This widespread use of mass graves is a mainstream historical fact. Grim archaeological evidence of the plague's catastrophic scale. The sight is unimaginable. Carts piled high with corpses, their faces blackened, their bodies bloated, are a common sight on the village paths. Children, parents, grandparents, entire families wiped out in a matter of days. You might see neighbours who had seemed hale and hearty just a week ago now lying lifeless, tossed into a communal pit. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air, a sickening perfume that permeates everything. The sheer emotional toll is immense. There's no time to grieve, no space for individual sorrow. Only a crushing, collective numbness as the weeks turn into months. the unthinkable happens. Villages begin to empty. What was once a bustling, if small, community of peasants, working the fields and sharing a communal life, becomes eerily silent. Hovels stand abandoned, their doors ajar, their fires long extinguished. The Lord's manor house, once a symbol of power, might itself fall silent, its inhabitants succumbing to the disease. Livestock wander untended, their lowing the only sound in deserted streets. The fields, once meticulously tilled, now lie fallow not by design, but by tragedy, slowly being reclaimed by weeds, this abandonment of entire settlements, leading to what historians call deserted medieval villages, DMVs, is a poignant, quirky tidbit that offers tangible proof of the plague's devastating impact. The social order unravels. Who will work the fields if everyone is dead? Who will pay the Lord his dues? The customary obligations that governed your life lose all meaning in the face of such overwhelming mortality. Some survivors, consumed by fear, might flee their homes, trying to escape the blight, further contributing to the desolation of their villages. Others might simply withdraw, paralyzed by grief and terror, waiting for their own inevitable end. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of seeing so much death, particularly within such a short period, led to a profound shift in medieval religious beliefs and societal values, fostering either extreme piety or a sense of nihilistic abandon. For those who remain, life becomes an exercise in bare survival amidst the ghosts of the departed. The fear of contagion means that even those who are still healthy might avoid contact with their neighbours. Isolating themselves further, the vibrant tapestry of medieval village life, woven from shared labour and communal bonds, is ripped apart, leaving behind only threads of memory and the chilling silence of absence. The land, once teeming with life, lies desolate, a stark monument to the millions who have perished. In the aftermath of the unimaginable devastation wrought by the Black Death, as the church bells slowly cease their incessant tolling and the mass graves fill, a strange and unexpected shift begins to ripple through the surviving population. The landscape of death, paradoxically, brings about a profound change in the balance of power, leading to what can only be described as labour shortages, shifting sands, for you, the surviving peasant. This means a subtle, yet revolutionary, change in your bargaining power, a concept previously unimaginable. Imagine the silence that now hangs over your village, broken only by the wind whistling through abandoned homes. But amidst the desolation, a new reality begins to emerge before the plague. There were too many hands for the land available, keeping wages low and obligations high. Now, there are simply too few. The sheer scale of mortality, estimated to have wiped out between 30% and 50%, and in some areas, even more, of Europe's population, meant that suddenly, labour was a scarce and valuable commodity. This demographic shift is a mainstream historical fact, fundamentally altering the economic landscape of the medieval world. You, who once barely scraped by, now find that your skills, your ability to plough a furrow, to sow a seed, to bring in a harvest, are suddenly in high demand. Lords, desperate to keep their domains productive and their revenues flowing, find themselves in an unprecedented position. They need you more than you need them. This newfound leverage is a fragile thing, born of tragedy, but it is real. You might hear whispers of peasants from neighbouring manors negotiating better terms, or even, astonishingly, leaving their traditional lands to seek higher wages elsewhere. The concept of a peasant freely moving was revolutionary. This is where the shifting sands truly come into play. For centuries, the feudal system had been static, almost immutable. The lord commanded, the peasant obeyed. But now, with a dramatic drop in the available workforce, the very foundation of that system began to crack. Lords who had previously taken your labour for granted now faced the very real prospect of their fields lying fallow and their barns empty if they couldn't attract or retain workers. A quirky tidbit is that in some desperate areas, Lords even offered incentives like smaller rents or more land to lure surviving peasants to their manors, a practice that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. This shift wasn't uniform across all regions, nor was it a sudden, immediate paradise for peasants. Some lords resisted fiercely, attempting to enforce old customs and obligations. But the economic reality was undeniable. If a lord insisted on harsh terms, his remaining peasants might simply pack up their meagre belongings and move to another manor where conditions were more favourable, or even seek work in the burgeoning towns. This forced competition among lords for a dwindling labour pool was a major, if often resisted, consequence of the plague. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was the primary driver of the decline of serfdom, or if it merely accelerated existing trends towards a more monetized economy and greater peasant mobility. For you, the survivor, this new reality is a source of cautious hope. The gnawing fear of famine remains. But the absolute power of the Lord is, for the first time in memory, slightly tempered. You still work the land, you still live a hard life, but the knowledge that your labor has value, that you might, just might, have a choice in your future, is a profound and liberating revelation in a world still reeling from death. The sands have indeed shifted, and though the ground beneath your feet remains uncertain, it feels, for a fleeting moment, a little less solid for your Lord, and a little more so for you, with the labor supply drastically reduced. A new, almost dizzying reality begins to emerge for you. Wages rise. Lords resist. For generations, your pay, whether in coin or kind, had been pitifully low, barely enough to keep your family alive. Now, with competition for your scarce hands, the economic scales begin to tilt, ever so slightly, in your favor. This sudden shift in value for your labor is both exhilarating and deeply unsettling for the established order. Imagine a farmer from a neighboring manor coming to your village, openly offering higher wages or better terms for your labor, or perhaps your own lord's bailiff, looking worried, suggests a smaller portion of your harvest is due this year, or even, astonishingly, offers a small payment in coin for extra work. This wasn't charity, this was pure economic necessity. With fewer people to work the fields, crops risked rotting in the ground, and the lord's wealth would dwindle. So, a bidding war, however subtle, began for the surviving workforce. This increase in real wages for labourers after the Black Death is a well-documented mainstream historical fact, leading to an improved standard of living for many surviving peasants. The lords, however, were not about to give up their power and wealth without a fight. They had benefited from a surplus of cheap labour for centuries, and this new dynamic was an affront to their perceived divine right and economic stability. Their resistance took many forms. Some lords simply refused to pay higher wages, hoping to coerce their existing tenants through force or intimidation. Others tried to enforce old customs more rigidly, reminding you of your ancestral obligations to the land and to them. A quirky tidbit is that some lords even attempted to reimpose stricter forms of serfdom in areas where it had begun to loosen, trying to reverse the tide of peasant mobility. This often led to increased tensions and resentment. The most significant form of resistance came from the authorities, the king and parliament. Seeing their traditional social order crumbling and fearful of rising peasant power, they attempted to control wages through legislation. This brings us to the famous, or infamous, from your perspective, Statute of Labourers, passed in England in 1351. This law aimed to fix wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for peasants to move to new manors without their lord's permission. Historians still argue whether such legislation was truly effective in the long run, or if the economic forces of supply and demand ultimately proved too powerful for legal decrees to suppress. For you, it meant the threat of legal repercussions if you dared to demand more or seek better opportunities. This period was a strange mix of newfound opportunity and continued oppression. While you might hear tales of a few lucky peasants buying their freedom or acquiring more land, the majority still faced immense pressure from their lords. The rising wages were a welcome change, but they came with the constant risk of punishment for defying the established order. The very idea that you, a peasant, could negotiate with your lord, or that your labour had a tangible market value, was revolutionary as you consider your options, perhaps discreetly inquiring about conditions in a nearby village. You feel a flicker of hope. The world is still harsh, and death is never far, but the absolute, unchanging grip of the Lord has loosened, just a little. The resistance of the powerful is fierce, but the simple, undeniable reality of too few hands for too much work gives you, for the first time in generations, a tiny sliver of leverage, and in your world, a tiny sliver of leverage can feel like a vast ocean of possibility. Despite the Lord's furious resistance and the legal attempts to shackle you with old wages and obligations, the sheer, undeniable force of economic reality often prevailed. This brings us to the statute of labourer's futility, a stark illustration of how even royal decrees and noble power struggled to suppress the fundamental laws of supply and demand in the aftermath of the Black Death. For you, the peasant, it meant that while the law existed, the practical needs of the economy often created loopholes or simply rendered it unenforceable. Imagine a farmer whose fields are lying fallow, their crops rotting because they refuse to pay the higher wages demanded by the few remaining labourers. The Lord might try to invoke the statute of labourers, threatening fines or imprisonment, but if every peasant in the vicinity is asking for more, and there are no new labourers to be found, what choice does he truly have? The alternative is ruin. This widespread circumvention and limited enforcement of the statute of labourers is a mainstream historical fact, highlighting the disconnect between legislation and the on-the-ground economic realities. The core problem for the authorities was simple: scarcity. The plague had killed so many people that the surviving workforce held a powerful, albeit unintended, monopoly on labour. If you, a peasant, were offered a shilling more to work on a neighbouring manor, and your current lord only offered half that, you might, despite the law, take the risk. How could the bailiff track every peasant's movement? How could every lord enforce the statute when their own lands desperately needed tilling? It was a bit like trying to stop a flood with a leaky bucket. A quirky tidbit about the statute of labourers is that it also sought to control prices of goods, aiming to restore pre-plague stability. But this too often failed. If fewer people were producing goods, and more people, the surviving labourers, had a bit more coin in their pockets to buy them, prices would naturally rise. It was a complex economic dance that the medieval authorities, with their limited understanding of market forces, struggled to comprehend or control. They saw it as a moral failing of the greedy peasant rather than an inevitable consequence of demographic collapse. The very act of threatening legal action often made things worse for the lords. If you felt unjustly treated, or if the punishments for moving or demanding higher wages were too severe, you might simply refuse to work, or run away to a town where you could blend in and find work as a craftsman or labourer, perhaps even as a casual labourer on docks or in workshops. These urban centres, often less controlled by manorial law, offered a degree of anonymity and opportunity that the countryside did not. Historians still argue whether the statute of labourers inadvertently fueled peasant discontent and contributed to later uprisings, like the Peasants' Revolt in England, by making the desperation and unfairness of the system even more apparent. So, while the statute of labourers was enacted with stern intent, its practical futility meant that economic pressure often won out. It was a constant game of cat and mouse. You, the peasant, might pretend to adhere to the old wages, but then work slower, or demand additional benefits in kind, like more food or a better hovel, or simply move when the opportunity arose and hope you weren't caught. The lords and authorities, for all their power, couldn't bring the dead back to life, and therefore couldn't restore the labour surplus that had been the foundation of their system. This economic shift, slow and hard-won, laid some of the earliest cracks in the rigid structure of feudalism, making your world, even amidst its continued hardships, subtly more fluid and less absolutely predetermined than it had been before the plague, from the ashes of widespread death. And despite the futile attempts by lords to turn back the clock, the shifting sands of labour created unprecedented avenues for you, the surviving peasant. This new landscape meant that new opportunities emerge, offering glimpses of a life beyond the rigid confines of serfdom and the manorial system. For perhaps the first time in generations, You had choices, however limited, that could genuinely alter the trajectory of your life. Imagine being able to negotiate before the plague. You were essentially told what to do and what you'd get. Now, if your lord was particularly stubborn about pre-plague wages, you might hear whispers of a lord on an adjacent manor offering better terms, perhaps less labour service, or even, astonishingly, a fixed cash rent instead of a share of your crops. This system, known as commutation of labour services, where you paid rent instead of providing free labour, slowly became more common. This was a mainstream historical fact that greatly increased peasant autonomy. It meant you could focus more on your own land and potentially produce a surplus to sell. The most significant new opportunity, however, was the ability to move before the plague. Leaving your manor without the lord's permission was a serious offence, often met with capture and harsh punishment, but with the drastic decline in population, lords were desperate to retain their remaining labour. If you heard that a town or another manor was offering better conditions, you might risk running away. Many did. Towns, in particular, became beacons of hope. They needed labourers for nascent industries, for construction, for serving the growing merchant class. A quirky tidbit is the medieval legal principle. Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free. This meant that if a serf could live in a town for a year and a day without being caught and claimed by their lord, they became a free person. Imagine the desperate dash, the year of hiding, the sweet taste of freedom that awaited some. This meant a chance for social mobility. While most peasants who moved to town still worked hard, often in low-skilled jobs, they were no longer bound to the land. They might become labourers, apprentices, even petty merchants. They had access to markets, to new ideas, and to a degree of anonymity that peasant villages simply couldn't offer. This migration from the countryside to urban centres is another key historical consequence of the plague, leading to the growth of medieval towns and a gradual shift in Europe's economic centre of gravity. Historians still argue whether the increased mobility led to a breakdown of traditional village structures or fostered new forms of community based on choice rather than birthright. For those who stayed on the land, opportunities also arose, with fewer people. There was more land per person. Some surviving peasants were able to expand their holdings, taking over the plots of those who had perished. They might even find themselves in a position to rent additional land from their lord, who was now desperate for tenants. This allowed some to accumulate more wealth, to move from subsistence farming to producing a small surplus for market, and to rise, however modestly. Within the rural hierarchy, this period, born from unimaginable tragedy, ironically presented a window of opportunity that had been closed for centuries. The chains of serfdom, while not entirely broken, were loosening. You, the medieval peasant, still faced immense hardship, but for the first time, the possibility of a different future, a life with more freedom, more choice, and perhaps even a little more prosperity, flickered tantalizingly on the horizon. It was a beacon of hope in a world still scarred by death. Even with the faint glimmer of new opportunities, the shadow of a far older, equally terrifying threat never truly recedes from your medieval life. Long before the Black Death, and continuing long after its first devastating wave, the spectre of famine's slow stranglehold was a constant, gnawing anxiety. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic apocalypse, but a gradual, agonizing descent into starvation, claiming lives with a quiet, relentless cruelty. Imagine the dread that begins to creep in when the spring rains fail to arrive, or when a sudden, unseasonal frost nips the young shoots in the bud. The signs are subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. The crops, which represent your family's very survival, are visibly struggling. You see your neighbours' faces tighten with worry, the shared glance conveying a profound sense of impending doom. This cycle of dependency on weather and primitive agricultural techniques made medieval Europe acutely vulnerable to widespread food shortages, a mainstream historical fact that defined peasant life for centuries. Famine wasn't just about a lack of food, it was a cascade of devastating effects. As grain stores dwindled, Prices would skyrocket, putting what little food remained out of reach for most peasants. You might be forced to sell your precious tools, perhaps even your livestock, just to buy a few handfuls of grain. This desperate sale of assets further crippled your ability to farm in the future, creating a vicious cycle of poverty and deeper hunger. It was a slow, agonizing process of impoverishment and physical decline. The physical toll of famine is insidious. Your body, already accustomed to a subsistence diet, begins to waste away. Muscles atrophy, bones become brittle, and your immune system, already battling constant infections from poor hygiene, collapses completely. Even if you don't starve outright, you become profoundly vulnerable to any disease that passes through the village. A common cold can become fatal. Dysentery sweeps through weakened populations, and even minor injuries can lead to deadly infections. A quirky tidbit is that during severe famines, records show instances of people resorting to eating tree bark, roots, or even, in the most extreme desperation, consuming animals that had died of disease. This highlights the absolute bottom of survival, where all notions of palatable food disappear. Unlike the swift, shocking devastation of plague, famine tightens its grip slowly, giving you time to despair, to watch your children weaken, to feel the constant ache in your own stomach. It strips away dignity and morality as people become desperate. Stories abound of desperate acts, theft of meager food supplies, abandonment of children, and even, in the darkest corners of human history, cannibalism, though such extreme cases were rare and often exaggerated in later accounts. Historians still argue whether medieval famines were primarily caused by climate shifts, like the onset of the Little Ice Age, or by the inherent inefficiencies and limitations of the medieval agricultural system itself, making populations perpetually vulnerable. Your life is a constant gamble against the elements. You scan the sky daily, praying for rain or for sunshine, depending on the need. You meticulously care for every seedling, knowing that each one represents a potential meal. The threat of famine is not just a historical concept, it is a primal fear, deeply embedded in your psyche, shaping your decisions, your prayers, and your constant weary toil. And as the meager ration of bread for the day disappears, the quiet anxiety of tomorrow's hunger returns, a familiar companion in your hard life. While famine was a constant, underlying threat, certain periods in medieval history were marked by particularly catastrophic and widespread food shortages. For you, living in the early 14th century, one such period stands out: the Great Famine's grip, 1315 to 1317. This wasn't just a bad harvest, it was a series of relentless crop failures that plunged large parts of Europe into an unprecedented crisis, offering a chilling preview of humanity's vulnerability before the Black Death arrived. Imagine the spring of 1315. Instead of the gentle, life-giving showers that encourage seeds to sprout, the heavens open with an unrelenting, torrential downpour, day after day, week after week. The rain falls, the fields, already waterlogged, become impassable bogs. Seeds rot in the cold, wet ground, and those that do sprout are quickly drowned or washed away. You watch, helpless, as your precious crops are ruined before they even have a chance to grow. This continuous heavy rainfall leading to widespread crop failure is a mainstream historical fact, pinpointed as the primary cause of the Great Famine. The summer offers no respite, the skies remain grey, the temperatures unusually low, preventing any successful growth. The ground is too wet to properly work. The harvests, when they finally come, are meager, rotten, or simply non-existent. The grains that do survive are so poor in quality that they barely offer sustenance. This isn't just a local problem. The same conditions are affecting vast swathes of Europe, from Russia to France, from Ireland to Italy. This widespread nature of the famine makes it great, differentiating it from more localized, common food shortages. As the famine tightens its grip, the prices of what little grain remains skyrocket beyond your wildest imagination. A measure of wheat that once cost a few pence now costs many shillings, putting it utterly out of reach. Your meager savings, if you have any, are quickly depleted. You're forced to sell off your valuable tools, then your seed grain for the next season, then perhaps your few animals. Each sale is a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable, but it only ensures deeper poverty and prolonged suffering. A quirky tidbit is that during this famine, there are accounts of wolves becoming so bold due to hunger that they would enter villages, and in some desperate areas, instances of cannibalism. Though, as with the plague, these extreme cases remain subjects of historical debate and were certainly not commonplace. The long-term effects of the Great Famine are devastating. Weakened by chronic malnutrition, the population becomes incredibly susceptible to disease. Epidemics of dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia sweep through villages, killing millions who are too weak to fight off even minor infections. Infant mortality rates soar, and many children born during this period suffer from developmental issues due to lack of nourishment. This period essentially created a generation that was physically and mentally scarred. A population already at a breaking point when the Black Death would arrive just a few decades later. Historians still argue whether the Great Famine, by pre-weakening the population, inadvertently contributed to the devastating mortality rates of the Black Death, or if the two events were largely independent but equally catastrophic. As you endure these years, the memory of perpetual hunger and the sight of your emaciated neighbors will be etched into your soul. The Great Famine is a stark lesson in the fragility of your existence, a brutal reminder that even without the horrors of plague or the tyranny of lords, nature itself could bring you to your knees. It leaves behind a generation accustomed to scarcity, hardened by suffering, and forever haunted by the silent, agonizing grip of hunger. When the Great Famine descends, and the meager stores of grains vanish, your life takes a desperate turn. The choices narrow to one terrifying imperative: find food or perish. This leads to the harrowing reality of eating anything edible, pushing the boundaries of what you consider sustenance. Your understanding of food expands to include desperate, often unpalatable, and sometimes dangerous alternatives. Imagine the last handful of moldy grain has been consumed. Your stomach cramps with perpetual hunger. You scour the fields, not for crops, but for weeds that might offer a hint of nourishment. Dandelions, nettles, even various grasses that a few months ago you would have dismissed as fodder for animals, now look like a potential meal. You learn which roots are safe to dig up, which wild berries, though small and bitter, won't poison you. This foraging for wild plants, often inedible under normal circumstances, becomes a mainstream historical fact during periods of severe famine. A grim testament to desperation, the line between human and animal food blurs completely. Your scrawny livestock, if you haven't already sold them, become too valuable to keep alive on dwindling feed. Their meat, though tough and scarce, offers a burst of calories, but even more grimly, you might resort to eating their feed, the hay meant for the cow, the oats for the horse. A truly quirky tidbit from historical accounts of famines describes people boiling leather, trying to extract any nutrients from belts, shoes, or even old animal hides, creating a kind of gelatinous, nutrient-poor broth. Imagine the sheer despair of gnawing on a boiled boot. The forests and wild areas become critical, but dangerous. Resources. You might brave the Lord's woods, risking punishment for poaching, just to find a squirrel, a bird's nest with eggs, or perhaps catch a desperate rabbit. Insects, grubs, and snails, normally reviled, might be considered if hunger becomes unbearable enough. Every bit of protein, no matter how small or unappetizing, is a victory. The desperation also means you might consume things that are spoiled or contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases, further exacerbating the mortality rate. Your body, already weakened by starvation, has little defense against such assaults. The concept of edible expands to encompass items that would normally be discarded as waste. Scraps from richer households, if any exist, are fought over. The bones of animals, stripped clean, might be boiled repeatedly to extract every last bit of marrow. Even the husks of grain, normally discarded after milling, might be ground into a coarse, indigestible powder to add bulk to a desperate porridge. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of prolonged starvation and consuming such desperate foods led to long-term changes in dietary habits or cultural food preferences in the medieval period. fostering a deep-seated fear of food waste for generations. This period of eating anything edible isn't just about physical hunger, it's about the erosion of human dignity. It's watching your neighbors, your friends, and your family waste away. Their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. It's the desperate choices you have to make. The constant internal battle between what is palatable and what is necessary for survival. As you chew slowly on a bitter root, or try to swallow a mouthful of coarse, half-rotted grain, you understand the true meaning of desperation. This isn't just history, this is the raw, unvarnished struggle for life itself. The grim reality of eating anything edible isn't the final stage of famine, rather, it's a precursor to an even more perilous state, becoming weakened by want. Your body, accustomed to perpetual exertion, begins to break down under the relentless siege of chronic malnutrition. This isn't about a single bad meal, it's about months, perhaps years, of insufficient calories and nutrients, leaving you utterly defenseless against the myriad threats of the medieval world. Imagine your muscles, once capable of wielding a heavy hoe all day, now feel like jelly. Every step is an effort, every breath shallow, your bones protrude, your skin sags, and your eyes sink into hollows. You feel a constant, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest can alleviate. This widespread physical deterioration due to prolonged malnutrition is a mainstream historical fact, turning populations into walking shadows of their former selves during famines. Your hair might become brittle and thin, your teeth might loosen, and even your vision could blur. The vibrancy of life slowly drains away, replaced by a dull, aching emptiness. Beyond the obvious physical wasting, chronic hunger has a more insidious effect. It decimates your immune system. Your body, starved of the protein and vitamins needed to build and maintain its defenses, becomes an open door for any disease that passes through the village. A simple cold, which a well-nourished person might shake off in a few days, can turn into a deadly pneumonia. A minor cut or scrape, usually a nuisance, can become a festering, life-threatening infection. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water or food, and remember, during famine, you're eating just about anything, sweeps through weakened communities like wildfire, its dehydration and relentless grip quickly claiming lives already on the brink. This vulnerability to secondary infections is why famine often led to epidemics, even before the Black Death. Consider the children, they are particularly vulnerable. Malnutrition in infancy and early childhood can permanently stunt growth and impair cognitive development, creating a generation that is smaller, weaker, and less able to contribute to the demanding labor of peasant life. You watch, helpless, as your younger siblings or your own children lose their playful energy, their laughter replaced by quiet whimpers of hunger, their bodies growing frail. A quirky tidbit is that during severe famines, women often stopped menstruating, and birth rates would plummet, a biological response to the extreme stress and lack of resources, ensuring fewer mouths to feed when survival was already tenuous. The mental and psychological toll is equally heavy. Constant hunger dulls the mind, making it difficult to focus, to plan, to even feel strong emotions beyond a pervasive sense of despair. Hope becomes a luxury you can ill afford. Your world shrinks to the immediate need for survival, pushing aside long-term goals or community concerns. Historians still argue whether the experience of repeated famines and the constant state of being weakened by want fostered a unique form of medieval fatalism or a hardened, resilient pragmatism in the peasant population, where every harvest was a temporary reprieve, not a guarantee. As you drag your emaciated body to the fields, the weight of your tools feels unbearable. Every task is a monumental effort. The cold bites deeper. The sun feels less warming. You are not just hungry, you are utterly, profoundly weakened. Your existence is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, but also a stark reminder of its absolute fragility when deprived of the most basic necessities for too long. You are walking a tightrope between existence and oblivion, and every step is a struggle. While the lords, the plagues, and the internal struggles for sustenance played their parts, you, the medieval peasant, were also at the mercy of a silent, immense force that dictated the success or failure of your entire year, climate change's cold hand. This wasn't the rapid, human-induced climate change of our modern era, but natural, long-term fluctuations that had profound and devastating effects on agriculture, particularly the period known as the Little Ice Age. Imagine the subtle shifts. Winters grow longer and harsher. With more frequent and intense snowfalls, springs arrive later, bringing with them lingering frosts that nip at newly sprouted crops. Summers are cooler and wetter, often punctuated by relentless rains that waterlog the fields and prevent grains from ripening properly. These meteorological shifts, a period of colder temperatures and increased rainfall in the northern hemisphere from roughly the early 14th to the mid-19th centuries, are a mainstream historical fact. For you, it means constant worry about the weather, a deepening sense of dread with every cloudy sky. The impact on your agricultural life is immediate and severe. The shorter growing seasons mean less time for your crops to mature. The increased rainfall leads to widespread crop failures, not just from drowning but also from fungal diseases that thrive in damp conditions. Your hardy grains, like rye and barley, which are usually reliable, now struggle. The ground, perpetually damp, is harder to work, and the chill in the air penetrates your thin clothing, making labor even more arduous. It's like working perpetually in a chilly, damp greenhouse that doesn't quite work. This climate shift also impacts your animals. The colder winters mean more fodder is needed, and if harvests fail, there's less to feed them, leading to animal deaths and further reducing your meager resources. Frozen rivers and prolonged snow cover can isolate villages, making trade and communication even more difficult. A quirky tidbit is that during the Little Ice Age, rivers like the Thames in London would frequently freeze solid enough to hold frost fairs on the ice, something unthinkable in later centuries. For you, the peasant, such spectacles are irrelevant. What matters is if the river provides water for your crops or if your sheep freeze in the fields. Historians still argue whether the onset of the Little Ice Age was a primary cause of the Great Famine in the early 14th century, or if it simply exacerbated existing vulnerabilities in the medieval agricultural system. What is undeniable, however, is that this prolonged period of climatic deterioration added another layer of profound challenge to your already precarious existence. You didn't have weather forecasts or climate models. You relied on generations of accumulated wisdom about planting times and seasonal patterns, knowledge that was now becoming increasingly unreliable. Your life becomes a perpetual battle against the elements. You scan the horizon for signs of a break in the clouds, or dread the approach of another long, biting winter. The cold seeps into your bones, and the dampness clings to your clothes. The sun, when it appears, feels weaker, its warmth a fleeting memory. This colder, wetter world makes every harvest a greater gamble, every surviving winter a triumph, and every year a testament to your unyielding resilience against the profound and indifferent power of nature. The cold hand of climate change guides much of your struggle, a force beyond your understanding or control, given the constant threats of famine, plague, and the cold hand of climate change. Your life as a medieval peasant is a continuous masterclass in crisis management. When faced with the grim prospect of a failing harvest, your strategies for coping with crop failure are rudimentary, born of desperation and generations of hard-won experience. There are no government subsidies or modern aid programs. Your survival rests entirely on your resourcefulness and the fragile bonds of community. Imagine the crushing despair as you survey your withered fields. Your first instinct is often prayer. You might join your fellow villagers in processions to the local church, begging for divine intervention, for rain, or for sunshine. While this might seem passive to a modern observer, for you, it's a vital act of hope and collective solace in the face of insurmountable odds, beyond spiritual appeals. However, practical, albeit limited, measures are taken. One immediate strategy is to broaden your search for food. As discussed, eating anything edible becomes the norm. You forage relentlessly in forests and uncultivated lands for wild berries, nuts, roots, and whatever meager greens you can find. This is dangerous work, as edible plants can be confused with poisonous ones, and venturing too far from the village exposes you to bandits or wild animals. This increased reliance on foraging during periods of crop failure is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the thin line between subsistence and starvation. Another tactic involves selling off any non-essential possessions. If you have any, perhaps a spare tool, a piece of worn clothing, or a small household item, This allows you to purchase what little grain might be available from more fortunate regions or from the Lord's dwindling stores, albeit at exorbitant prices. This desperate sale of assets further impoverishes you, making recovery from the famine even harder. But it's a necessary evil to buy a few more days of life. Your livestock, though precious, often become a grim necessity. If you haven't sold them, you might slaughter your scrawny cow or pig to provide immediate sustenance, knowing full well that this removes a crucial asset for future farming. This short-term gain comes at the long-term cost of losing your means of production and transportation. A quirky tidbit is that in some regions, peasants would resort to consuming their seed corn, the grain saved for planting the next season. While this provided immediate relief from hunger, it guaranteed a lack of harvest in the following year, leading to a prolonged and even deeper famine. It's a literal example of sacrificing the future for the present. Migration is another desperate coping mechanism. If a nearby region has had a slightly better harvest, or if rumors of work spread, you might make the agonizing decision to leave your village, becoming a wandering beggar, hoping to find food or charity elsewhere. This, however, is a dangerous journey, fraught with peril and uncertainty. Many who left their villages during famines never returned. Historians still argue whether the increased mobility and abandonment of lands during famines contributed more to the breakdown of traditional manorial structures or to the resilience of those who managed to find new opportunities. Ultimately, coping with crop failure is a desperate dance with death. It's about rationing, hoping for relief, and making agonizing choices that pit immediate survival against future viability. You endure the hunger pangs, the weakening of your body, and the gnawing fear for your family. Every day that you survive is a small victory, a testament to your unyielding will to live, even as the land fails you, even when your fields manage to yield something. The next challenge immediately presents itself: storage and scarcity. In your medieval world, without modern refrigeration or pest control, preserving food is a constant battle against spoilage, rot, and vermin. Every bushel of grain, every dried piece of meat, is vulnerable, meaning that periods of plenty can quickly give way to devastating scarcity. Imagine the harvest, a time of intense labor and momentary relief. The grains, wheat, barley, rye, oats, are threshed by hand, separating the precious kernels from the husks. You then carefully transport them to your meager storage spaces. For most peasants, this means storing grain in wooden chests, woven baskets, or simply in sacks on the floor of your hovel. The damp earth floor, the ever-present mice and rats, and the humid conditions are constant threats to your precious food supply. This fundamental challenge of food storage and preservation is a mainstream historical fact, severely limiting food security for medieval populations beyond grains. Other foodstuffs also present significant storage hurdles. Vegetables like cabbages and root crops such as turnips and carrots might be stored in a cool, dark cellar if your hovel has one, or simply buried in pits in the ground, covered with straw. However, they are highly susceptible to rot and frost. Meat, a rare luxury, could be preserved by salting or smoking, but these methods required specific conditions and resources that were often beyond the means of the poorest peasants. Fish, if caught, had to be eaten fresh or laboriously dried, without canning or freezing. The shelf life of most foods was incredibly short, making year-round sustenance a continuous struggle. The constant threat of pests is another major concern: mice and rats, ubiquitous in your mud and wattle hut. See your stored grain as their personal buffet. You might set crude traps or keep a vigilant cat, but the losses are inevitable. Weevils and other insects can infest dried goods, rendering them inedible. Mold and mildew thrive in the damp conditions, turning precious bread and cheese into poisonous growth. Every lost portion is a direct hit to your family's fragile food security. A quirky tidbit is that in some manor houses and monasteries, they had specialized, elevated granaries called dovecotes, not just for pigeons, a source of meat, but also because the design, with its smooth, overhanging ledges, made it harder for rats to climb up and into the grain stores below. Your humble hovel offered no such sophisticated protection. The consequence of these storage challenges is that even a good harvest doesn't guarantee a full stomach year-round. The period leading up to the next harvest, often called the lean season or hungry gap, is always the most precarious. Your stores from the previous year dwindle, and fresh food is not yet available. This is when the spectre of scarcity truly manifests, and you learn to stretch every last morsel, rationing food carefully, knowing that any miscalculation could mean starvation. Historians still argue whether medieval scarcity was primarily a result of low agricultural yields or inadequate storage and distribution systems, or a combination of both. As you look at your limited stores, carefully stacked in a corner, you understand the fragility of your existence. Every piece of food is a victory against entropy, against the relentless forces of nature that conspire to spoil your sustenance. The constant battle against rot, rodents, and the passage of time is just another facet of your unending struggle for survival in a world where plenty is fleeting and scarcity is the ever-present norm, in a world constantly assailed by famine, plague, and the arbitrary power of lords. You, the medieval peasant, found solace and structure in a constant, unwavering presence, the village church's comfort. It wasn't just a building, it was the spiritual heart of your community, a sanctuary from hardship, and a central pillar of your social and cultural life. Imagine the small stone or timber church standing proudly, perhaps the most substantial building in your humble village. Its spire or bell tower would be the tallest structure for miles, a beacon visible across the fields. Inside, it might be dimly lit by candles, filled with the scent of incense and damp earth, yet it offered a sense of awe and reverence. This central role of the church in medieval life, both spiritual and social, is a mainstream historical fact, woven deeply into the fabric of daily existence. The church dictated the rhythm of your week and your year. Sundays were for worship, a mandatory break from the relentless toil where you would gather with your entire village for Mass. Even if you didn't understand every word of the Latin liturgy, the rituals, the hymns, and the shared experience provided a profound sense of community and spiritual connection. The sound of the church bell marked not just the hours of prayer, but also the times for work, for rest, and for danger. A quirky tidbit is that medieval church bells often had names and were believed to have protective powers, warding off storms or evil spirits. Beyond Sunday Mass, the church was the focal point for all of life's significant events. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, all took place within its hallowed walls, marking the passages of your existence from birth to death. It was where your children were blessed, where you exchanged vows, and where your loved ones were mourned. The churchyard, with its simple wooden markers, was the final resting place for generations of your family and neighbors, tying you physically to the land, even in death, during times of famine or plague. The church often served as a beacon of hope and practical assistance. While its resources were limited, the local priest might organize alms for the poorest, or offer comfort and spiritual guidance to the sick and dying. The belief that your suffering was part of God's divine plan, or a test of faith, offered a framework for understanding unimaginable hardship, even if it didn't alleviate the physical pain. Historians still argue whether the church's role during crises primarily fostered fatalism and resignation, or if it provided crucial psychological resilience and communal cohesion that helped people endure. The church also offered a sense of order and morality in a chaotic world. The priest, often the most educated person in the village, would preach sermons that reinforced community values, explained biblical stories, and outlined the path to salvation, while perhaps not always comforting. The fear of eternal damnation also served as a powerful deterrent against grave sins, contributing to the social fabric of the village. For you, the peasant, the church was more than just a place of worship. It was a constant, solid presence, a shared identity, and a profound source of meaning in a life otherwise dominated by physical struggle. As you kneel on the cold, hard floor, the faint light from the stained glass window illuminates your calloused hands, and for a brief moment, the worries of the field and the Lord seem to recede. Within the embrace of the village church, your faith as a medieval peasant was not a detached, intellectual exercise. It was a vibrant, visceral part of daily life, expressed through saints, prayers, and pilgrimages. These spiritual practices weren't just about abstract salvation, they were direct appeals for protection, healing, and good fortune in a world brimming with peril. Imagine your small, rough-hewn wooden crucifix, or the worn statue of a saint in the corner of the church, perhaps Saint Roche, invoked against plague, or Saint Isidore, patron of farmers. You pray to them directly, believing they act as intermediaries between you and God. Each saint has a specific purpose, a specialty if you will, like a spiritual specialist on call. If your child is sick, you might pray to Saint Blaise for throat ailments. If your crops are failing, you appeal to local agricultural saints. This direct, often very personal, relationship with the saints is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the tangible nature of medieval piety. You don't just pray to God, you pray through these benevolent figures. Prayer itself is a constant companion. Before you sow, you pray for a good harvest. Before you eat, you give thanks for the meager meal. Before you sleep, you pray for protection from evil and for a safe morning. You know the Pater Noster, Our Father, and Ave Maria, Hail Mary, by heart, reciting them often, perhaps even counting them on a string of beads, a precursor to the Rosary. This constant invocation of the divine isn't just ritual, it's a deep-seated belief that every outcome, good or bad, is ultimately in God's hands. And then there are pilgrimages, a monumental undertaking for someone like you. Imagine saving every spare coin, every scrap of food, for months or even years, just to undertake a journey to a distant shrine. Perhaps it's to Canterbury to visit the tomb of Thomas Becket, or a local shrine dedicated to a particularly potent saint. A quirky tidbit is that pilgrims would often wear specific badges or carry staffs, sometimes adorned with holy symbols, identifying them as travelers seeking divine grace. These journeys were physically arduous and dangerous, fraught with bandits, illness, and exposure to the elements. Yet, you undertake them, believing that a direct encounter with holy relics or sacred sites can bring miraculous healing, forgiveness of sins, or simply profound spiritual merit. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of pilgrimage served primarily as a means of social control, reinforcing church authority, or if it genuinely offered peasants a rare opportunity for travel, adventure, and a temporary escape from the grinding monotony of their daily lives. For you, it's probably a bit of both. The journey itself is a penance, a test of faith, but the destination offers the tantalizing promise of divine intervention, a glimpse of the sacred that transcends your earthly struggles. As you return to your village, perhaps with a small pilgrim badge sewn onto your tunic, you carry not just physical exhaustion, but a renewed sense of hope and spiritual fortitude. The world around you remains harsh, the Lord still demands his dues, and hunger still lurks. But you have touched the sacred, you have communicated with your saints, and you believe, deep in your soul, that you are not forgotten by the divine. This spiritual resilience, nurtured through prayer and the arduous journey of pilgrimage, is a powerful, if intangible, force that helps you endure the unendurable when sickness strikes your hovel and the familiar ache of fever grips a loved one. You don't call for a doctor in a white coat. Instead, you turn to the practical, if often limited, knowledge of local healers and folk remedies. In your medieval world, medicine is a blend of empirical observations, inherited wisdom, and a generous dose of superstition, far removed from modern scientific understanding. Imagine your child burning with fever, their breath ragged. Your first recourse might be to the village elder, perhaps an old woman known as a wise woman or a cunning man, who has a reputation for knowing the properties of herbs and the secrets of the forest. These individuals, often without formal training but with years of practical experience, are the closest thing you have to medical professionals. This reliance on local, often female, healers and traditional herbal medicine is a mainstream historical fact. The primary healthcare system for the vast majority of medieval peasants. They might offer poultices of mashed herbs for wounds, or bitter concoctions of roots and leaves to fight a fever. Their knowledge is passed down orally, from generation to generation, a patchwork of effective remedies mixed with practices that might do more harm than good. For instance, they might apply cobwebs to stop bleeding, or use urine as an antiseptic. Some remedies are surprisingly effective. Willow bark, containing salicylates, the precursor to aspirin, for pain and fever, or various herbs for digestive issues. Others are less so. Bordering on the bizarre, a quirky tidbit is the use of sympathetic magic, where a cure might involve rubbing a sick person with a stolen piece of bacon and then burying the bacon, believing the sickness would transfer to the buried meat and decay with it, or perhaps tying a bag of dried toad to the neck of a patient with the plague, hoping its coldness would draw out the heat of the disease. The understanding of disease causation is incredibly rudimentary. You believe illness is caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, or by bad air, miasma, or more commonly, by witchcraft, curses, or divine punishment for sin. This lack of germ theory means hygiene practices are virtually non-existent, and illnesses spread easily. When a contagious disease like dysentery sweeps through the village, the healer can do little more than offer palliative care and comfort, and pray. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of medieval folk medicine was primarily psychological due to the placebo effect and the power of belief, or if genuinely effective herbal remedies offered more tangible benefits than previously acknowledged for more serious ailments. Or if the local remedies fail, your options are grim. There are no hospitals in your village, and the few monastic infirmaries or city hospitals are typically for the clergy or the wealthy. You rely on your family to nurse you, to keep you warm, and to offer what little food or drink you can stomach. The spiritual aspect of healing is paramount. Prayers, visits to shrines, and invocations of saints are often considered as important, if not more so, than any herbal remedy. As you administer a bitter-smelling brew to your ailing child, you do so with a mixture of hope and resignation. You trust the wisdom of the old woman, but you also understand that in the face of serious illness, your power is limited. Your life is a constant dance with sickness and death, and in this dance, the local healer is your fragile, often desperate, guide, offering what comfort and cure they can in a world that offers precious little, in a world that constantly throws plagues, famines, and demanding lords at you, where individual survival seems a near impossible feat. You quickly learn the invaluable strength of communal bonds and mutual aid. Your village isn't just a collection of hovels, it's a living, breathing entity, and its collective resilience is often the only thing that keeps you from succumbing to the harsh realities of medieval life. Imagine your neighbour's roof collapsing after a severe storm. There's no insurance, no professional construction crew to call. Instead, the entire village pitches in. Men might haul timber, women prepare food for the workers, and children gather thatch. Everyone contributes what they can, knowing that tomorrow it might be their hovel that needs repair. This informal, yet deeply ingrained system of mutual assistance is a mainstream historical fact, the backbone of peasant society. You work collectively on each other's fields during peak seasons, share tools, and lend a hand whenever a crisis strikes. This isn't charity in the modern sense, it's a pragmatic necessity, built on reciprocal obligations. You help your neighbour today, because you will undoubtedly need their help tomorrow. This unwritten social contract is as strong, if not stronger, than any formal law. If a family falls ill during harvest, preventing them from gathering their crops, other families will step in, ensuring that at least some food is saved. If an elder is too frail to work, the community might quietly ensure they receive enough food to survive. It's a subtle but powerful redistribution of resources, driven by shared survival. The village well, the communal oven, the common pasture, these are all shared resources that necessitate cooperation. You might have scheduled times to use the oven, or established rules for grazing livestock on the commons. These collective agreements, often enforced by community pressure rather than formal laws, reflect a deep understanding that individual prosperity is inextricably linked to the well-being of the whole. A quirky tidbit is that medieval villages often had specific officials, sometimes elected by the peasants themselves, like a hayward who looked after the hedges and fences, or a woodward who managed the timber, highlighting this collective management of resources during severe crises like famine or plague. These communal bonds are tested to their limits, but often hold firm. While there might be instances of selfishness and despair, the dominant response is often a strengthening of solidarity. The shared experience of suffering creates a powerful sense of us against the world. You mourn together, you pray together, and you struggle together. Historians still argue whether the strong communal ties in medieval villages were primarily a result of the necessity for survival, or if they reflected deeply ingrained cultural values of collectivism and tradition that predated widespread hardship. As you sit by the communal fire, sharing a meagre meal with your neighbours, the familiar faces around you are a source of profound comfort. You might not have much, but you have each other. This collective spirit, this unspoken agreement to stand together against the relentless pressures of your world, is perhaps the most powerful tool in your peasant survival kit. It's the warmth of shared laughter, the quiet understanding in a glance, and the certainty that when disaster strikes, you will not face it alone. This mutual aid, born of hardship, is the enduring strength of your village in a life dominated by relentless toil, perpetual hunger, and the constant shadow of death. Even the smallest respite is cherished. For you, the medieval peasant, these rare moments arrive in the form of feasts, fairs, and festivals, offering temporary escapes from the grinding monotony and a much-needed injection of joy and communal celebration. Imagine the sheer anticipation. For weeks, perhaps, there have been whispers of an upcoming Saints' Day celebration, or the annual market fair in a nearby town. These aren't just social gatherings, they are vital interruptions in the hard rhythm of your life. The Lord might declare a holiday from labour on his domain, a rare and welcome gift. These religious holidays and seasonal fairs are a mainstream historical fact, providing crucial breaks from work and opportunities for social interaction and trade. A feast, usually tied to a religious festival like Christmas, Easter, or a local Saints' Day, meant a temporary abundance of food. While your daily diet was monotonous grains, a feast might mean a taste of meat, perhaps even a bit of ale or rough wine. Imagine the sensory overload, the smell of roasting meat, even if it's just a scrawny chicken or a few geese. The rare sweetness of a bit of honey or fruit, the convivial chatter and laughter of your neighbours. This wasn't about Michelin stars, it was about the sheer, unadulterated joy of enough food and a momentary reprieve from hunger. A quirky tidbit is that even during these feasts, strict social hierarchies were often maintained, with the lord and his family eating separately and often with finer foods than the peasants, reminding everyone of their place even in celebration. Fairs, on the other hand, offered a different kind of escape. These were larger gatherings, often held annually in market towns, where merchants from further afield would come to sell goods. For you, a visit to the fair was a momentous occasion. Imagine the cacophony, the shouts of vendors, the lowing of livestock, the music of wandering minstrels. You might see exotic goods you'd never encounter in your village, fine cloth, metal tools, perhaps even a rare spice from the East. It was a chance to sell any small surplus you might have, buy something practical like a new knife or a bit of salt, or simply to gawk at the wonders of the outside world. It also provided an opportunity to gather news and rumours from distant places, breaking the isolation of your village life. Historians still argue whether medieval fairs were primarily economic events, facilitating trade, or important cultural gatherings that reinforced social bonds and provided entertainment. These festivals and fairs were crucial for mental and emotional well-being. They offered a release valve for the accumulated stress and hardship. Laughter, singing, dancing, and even simple games were common. For a brief period, the worries of the next harvest or the Lord's demands could be pushed aside. You might hear a travelling storyteller or watch a crude puppet show, transporting you momentarily to a world of heroes and dragons. These shared moments of joy, however fleeting, reinforced communal bonds and provided the necessary psychological fortitude to return to the relentless toil. As the sun sets on a festival day, and you trudge back to your hovel, your belly a little fuller, your mind a little lighter, the memory of the laughter and the brief abundance lingers. It's a precious memory, one that you'll cling to during the long, hard months of winter or during the anxieties of a failing crop. These feasts, fairs, and festivals are not just about food and entertainment, they are about the enduring human need for celebration, for community, and for a temporary escape from the ever-present difficulties of medieval peasant life. Even when the belly is empty and the body is weary, the human spirit finds ways to persist. And for you, the medieval peasant, this often manifests in songs, stories, and simple pleasures. These cultural touchstones, passed down through generations, provide not just entertainment but also a vital sense of identity, continuity, and a momentary escape from the relentless grind of daily life. Imagine the long, dark evenings in your hovel. The only light flickering from the central fire. There are no books, no plays, no screens to distract you. Instead, the air is filled with voices. Your grandmother might recount ancient tales of heroes and mythical beasts, or perhaps stories of local saints and miracles. Your father might sing a ballad about a tragic love or a triumphant battle from long ago. These oral traditions, passed down from one generation to the next, are a mainstream historical fact. The primary form of entertainment and cultural transmission in a largely illiterate society. They are your history books, your moral lessons, and your escape into realms beyond your muddy fields. The content of these stories and songs often reflects your reality. There are tales of cunning peasants outsmarting foolish lords, offering a vicarious sense of justice. There are songs lamenting the harshness of winter or celebrating the abundance of a good harvest. Humor, often dark and satirical, helps to cope with hardship. A quirky tidbit is the prevalence of animal fables, like the tales of Reynard the fox, where weak but clever animals outwit stronger, more foolish ones, often serving as thinly veiled social commentary on the power dynamics between peasants and nobles. These stories provided both amusement and a subtle outlet for frustration. Music, often simple and communal, is another cherished pleasure. Perhaps someone in the village plays a rough flute or a simple stringed instrument. More often, it's unaccompanied singing, work songs that lighten the burden of labor, celebratory songs at feasts, or mournful laments at funerals. Everyone participates, adding their voice to the collective chorus. These aren't polished performances, they are spontaneous expressions of shared emotion and experience. Historians still argue whether the themes of resistance and social commentary in peasant folklore were conscious attempts at subversion or simply an innocent reflection of daily grievances. Beyond these communal artistic expressions, simple pleasures provide solace: the warmth of the fire on a cold night, the taste of a fresh-baked piece of coarse bread, the laughter of your children, the simple beauty of a sunrise over the familiar fields. These are moments of quiet joy. A drink of ale, though often thin and watery, can momentarily lift spirits. The camaraderie of your neighbors, sharing a joke or a moment of quiet understanding, is a profound comfort. These small, fleeting moments of happiness are treasured precisely because they are so rare and hard-won. As you listen to a familiar tune or the start of a well-loved story, you feel a connection to generations past and to your fellow villagers. These shared cultural experiences weave a strong tapestry of community, reminding you that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human spirit yearns for beauty, for connection, and for meaning. These songs and stories are not just sounds, they are the enduring heartbeat of your medieval peasant life, helping you to forget, for a precious few moments, the struggles of the day and drift towards a more pleasant dream, as your medieval world slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to change. A new and unsettling pressure starts to redefine the relationship between you, the peasant, and the land you depend upon. This is the changing landscape of land, specifically the gradual, often contentious, process of enclosure and its profound impact on your traditional rights and way of life. Imagine your village's fields, traditionally divided into narrow, unfenced strips, scattered across vast open expanses. You work your strips, but you also have customary rights to use the commons, shared pastures, woodlands, and waste ground where you can graze your animals, gather firewood, or forage for wild foods. This system of open field farming and communal rights is a mainstream historical fact. The backbone of medieval peasant agriculture for centuries. It's inefficient by modern standards, but it's equitable. ensuring everyone has access to some resources. Now, imagine the lord, or perhaps a wealthier peasant, decides they want to consolidate their holdings. They begin to fence off these open fields, converting scattered strips into larger, contiguous blocks. More crucially, they start to enclose the common lands, turning areas that were traditionally shared by the entire village into private property. This act, often done without your consent or compensation, is devastating. Your few scrawny animals now have nowhere to graze. Your family's supply of firewood dwindles. The very resources that buffered you against starvation are being systematically taken away. This process of enclosure, which gains momentum in the later medieval period and accelerates into the early modern era, is often driven by economic forces. The rising value of wool, for instance, might incentivize lords to convert arable land into sheep pastures, which require far fewer laborers. This is a quirky tidbit, sometimes. The very demand for your skills in other areas, like textile production, contributed to the loss of your traditional agricultural rights. It meant that while some peasants might find work in wool production, many others were simply displaced. Losing their direct access to subsistence, the impact on your life is immediate and severe. Without the commons, you become even more vulnerable to crop failure and famine. You lose a crucial safety net. The social fabric of the village also strains under this pressure, as traditional rights are eroded and individual prosperity becomes increasingly tied to private ownership rather than communal access. While enclosure often led to more efficient, specialized farming in the long run, for you, the peasant, it often meant impoverishment, displacement, and a breakdown of the familiar ways of life. Historians still argue whether enclosure was a necessary step towards agricultural modernization or a brutal act of social injustice that dispossessed millions of peasants from their ancestral lands. You might protest, but your voice is often unheard against the power of the lord and the changing economic tides. You might gather with your neighbors, discussing the injustice, perhaps even attempting to pull down fences under the cover of darkness, but such acts are dangerous and often futile in the long run. The landscape around you, once a shared resource, is slowly being carved up, sectioned off, and claimed by individual owners. The open fields are giving way to fenced pastures, and your traditional rights are being replaced by private property. It's a fundamental shift, subtly but profoundly altering the very ground beneath your feet and the traditional rhythms of your life. As the landscape changes, so too does the very nature of your bondage to the land. The strictures of serfdom, while once absolute, begin a slow, grinding process of erosion, eventually shifting from serfdom towards a more flexible, albeit still challenging, system of tenant farming. This transition isn't sudden or uniform, but it represents a profound, multi-century evolution in your relationship with your lord and your labor. Imagine a world where your ancestors were literally tied to the soil, unable to leave the manor without their lord's permission, bought and sold along with the land. Your own life started similarly, marked by inherited obligations to provide labor service, corvée, and a myriad of payments in kind. This system of serfdom, where peasants were legally bound to the land, is a mainstream historical fact. Defining much of the early medieval period, it was a life of hereditary servitude, passed down through generations. However, the forces unleashed by the Black Death, combined with economic shifts like the increasing use of money and the growth of towns, gradually began to loosen these chains. With a reduced labor force, remember those shifting sands? Lords became more willing to commute labor services into cash payments. Instead of working 3 days a week on the lord's domain, you might now pay a fixed rent in coin. This was a crucial step. It meant your time was now more your own, allowing you to focus entirely on your own plot and potentially generate a surplus. This commutation of labor services into money rents is a key element of the decline of serfdom. This doesn't mean you're entirely free. You still owe rent, and the lord still controls the land, but you are now increasingly a tenant farmer, leasing your land rather than being bound to it. This new arrangement offers a degree of personal freedom previously unimaginable. You can, theoretically, pack up your meager belongings at the end of your lease and seek land on another manor with better terms. This ability to move, though still risky, is a significant departure from the hereditary immobility of serfdom. A quirky tidbit is that this shift sometimes led to a surprising increase in peasant literacy. as written contracts and leases became more common, requiring a basic ability to understand agreements. The transition from serfdom was not a smooth, linear progression. Some lords fought to maintain the old ways, trying to reimpose stricter controls, which often led to increased peasant unrest and even revolts. Others, more pragmatic, recognized that adapting to the new economic realities was essential for their own survival. Historians still argue whether the decline of serfdom was primarily driven by the demographic shock of the Black Death, the inherent economic inefficiencies of the system, or the growing resistance and agency of the peasants themselves. For you, the peasant living through these changes, it feels like a slow, arduous crawl towards something akin to greater autonomy. As generations pass, the feudal ties weaken further. While you may still face poverty, hard labor, and the demands of landlords, the direct, hereditary personal bondage of serfdom largely recedes. You become, increasingly, an economic actor, albeit a small one, dealing in rents and contracts rather than enforced service. It's a fundamental shift, moving your society, inch by painful inch, from one based on status and birth to one increasingly influenced by economic considerations. The freedom is relative, the struggle is constant, but the heavy yoke of absolute serfdom is slowly, thankfully, lifting from your shoulders as the old certainties of the manorial system begin to crumble. A different kind of economic hub gains increasing prominence, drawing you, the peasant, out of your isolated village and into a wider world. The rise of market towns. These bustling centres are not just places to trade, they are catalysts for change, fostering new opportunities and slowly eroding the strict self-sufficiency of your immediate manor. Imagine the annual trek you, or perhaps your father, might lead a scrawny pig or a few sacks of surplus grain, trundling along dusty tracks to the nearest market town. The journey itself is an event, a break from the relentless rhythm of the fields. As you approach, the air changes, filled with the mingled smells of livestock, baking bread, and unfamiliar spices. The cacophony of voices, the shouts of merchants, and the clatter of carts assault your senses. This growth of market towns, facilitating regional trade and specialization, is a mainstream historical fact, signaling a gradual shift away from purely subsistence economies. These towns are where the economic lifeblood of the region truly flows. Here, you can sell your small surplus, perhaps a few eggs, some butter, or a handful of woven cloth your wife produced. This simple act of selling connects you to a wider economy, allowing you to acquire something you can't produce yourself, like a metal tool from the blacksmith, a bit of salt, or a more durable piece of fabric. This reliance on money, even if minimal, starts to change your mindset, making you think beyond mere survival to potential acquisition. The market town is also a place of information. You hear news and rumors from distant manors, from other towns, even from abroad, carried by traveling merchants. You learn about fairer lords, higher wages for laborers, remember that labor shortage, or better prices for certain goods. This flow of information is invaluable, empowering you with knowledge that can sometimes be leveraged against your own lord's demands. It's like a medieval news network, delivered by foot and cart. A quirky tidbit is that many medieval market towns had a specific market cross where official proclamations were made and sometimes public punishments were carried out, serving as both a commercial and civic hub. These towns also offer new opportunities for those brave or desperate enough to leave the land. As mentioned before, the city air makes you free principle drew many former serfs seeking anonymity and a chance at a different life. They might find work as unskilled laborers, porters, or apprentices to various craft guilds, while urban life had its own hardships, overcrowding, disease, poor sanitation. It also offered a glimmer of social mobility that was impossible in the rigid manorial system. Historians still argue whether the growth of market towns led primarily to the enrichment of merchants and landlords, or if it also offered genuine, albeit limited, economic improvement and social freedom for the peasant class, for the peasant who remains on the land. The market town serves as a crucial intermediary. It connects you to a network of producers and consumers, slowly integrating your isolated village into a larger economic system. It introduces you to a monetary economy, making the old system of payments in kind seem increasingly cumbersome. and it offers a glimpse of a different kind of life, one less directly tied to the soil and the Lord, fostering desires and ambitions that slowly chip away at the traditional feudal order. As you head back to your village, your few purchased items clutched tightly, the distant murmur of the market town stays with you, a powerful symbol of change on the horizon. Despite the grinding nature of your labor, the medieval period wasn't entirely devoid of innovation, albeit at a pace that would seem glacial to us today. For you, the peasant, these were new tools, small advances, subtle improvements in agricultural technology that, while not revolutionary, collectively offered incremental gains in productivity and, sometimes, a slight easing of your unending toil. Imagine your back aching from dragging the ard, that primitive scratch plough that barely broke the surface of the soil. Then, perhaps, word spreads, or a travelling artisan brings knowledge of the heavy-wheeled plough. This innovation, a mainstream historical fact, was a game-changer for certain regions. Unlike the ard, the heavy plough had a coulter to cut the sod, a share to slice horizontally, and a mould-board to turn the furrow over. This deep turning of the soil aerated it better, brought fresh nutrients to the surface, and helped suppress weeds more effectively, leading to better yields. It was still incredibly heavy, often requiring multiple oxen, but it fundamentally transformed how land was tilled in many parts of Europe. Beyond the plough, other smaller advancements made a difference. The development of the horse collar, which shifted the pulling burden from the horse's neck to its shoulders, allowed horses to pull ploughs more efficiently and for longer periods without choking. Before this, oxen, though slower, were often preferred for heavy work due to their neck structure. This seemingly minor invention had a significant impact on agricultural output in areas where horses were available. A quirky tidbit is that the horseshoe, too, became more widespread during this period, providing better traction and protecting the hooves of working animals, allowing them to work on harder ground and for longer hours. Watermills and windmills, though powered by natural forces, also slowly became more prevalent for grinding grain. Instead of the laborious task of grinding grain by hand or relying on rudimentary hand querns, you might now take your grain to the Lord's mill and pay a fee, of course, significantly reducing the time and effort needed for this crucial part of food preparation. While not a tool you owned, the existence of a nearby mill was an undeniable advance. Historians still argue whether these technological advancements were truly widespread enough to fundamentally transform medieval agriculture, or if they primarily benefited richer peasants and lords, with many poorer peasants still relying on older, more primitive methods. For you, these advances were often slow to arrive, if they arrived at all. Knowledge spread by word of mouth, by observation, or by the slow migration of people. Adopting new tools meant investment, perhaps a collective effort to purchase a share in a heavy plough, or saving up to buy a better quality scythe. But when they did come, even small improvements were noticed. A slightly sharper scythe meant less effort cutting hay. A better harrow meant a more even seed bed. These weren't industrial revolutions, but rather incremental steps forward, born from necessity and observation. They chipped away at the sheer brute force required for survival, making the land slightly more yielding, the labour slightly less backbreaking. You might still live a life of arduous toil, but the existence of these new tools offered a subtle glimmer of progress, a quiet testament to human ingenuity even in the most challenging of times. And as you wield a slightly more efficient tool, you feel a small, almost imperceptible, easing of your daily burden beyond the physical hardships of field, famine, and plague. Your life as a medieval peasant also demands an extraordinary degree of the peasant's mental fortitude. This isn't about formal education or philosophical debates. It's about the sheer, unyielding psychological resilience required to face constant adversity, maintain hope, and simply keep going day after day, year after year. Imagine waking up knowing that your entire existence hangs by a thread. One bad harvest, one sick animal, one unjust demand from the Lord, and your family could face starvation or homelessness. This constant precarity fosters a unique mental toughness. You learn to live with uncertainty, to accept setbacks as inevitable, and to find strength in perseverance. This profound capacity for endurance in the face of overwhelming odds is a mainstream historical fact, often overlooked in the focus on economic and social structures. Your mind is trained, not in logic or rhetoric, but in resilience. This fortitude manifests in various ways. There's a deep pragmatism. You focus on what you can control, the quality of your work, the care of your family, and let go of what you cannot. Like the weather or the Lord's mood, you learn patience, a virtue born of the slow rhythms of agriculture. Planting seeds and waiting months for a harvest, enduring a long winter, or recovering from a famine, all demand an immense capacity for delayed gratification and quiet waiting. You also develop a unique form of fatalism, not necessarily a surrender to despair, but an acceptance of the hand you've been dealt, God's will, the forces of nature, the established order. These are powerful forces that you cannot challenge directly, so you find strength in enduring, in adapting, and in seeking small victories where you can. A quirky tidbit is the common medieval adage, God helps those who help themselves, reflecting a blend of religious faith with a strong emphasis on personal effort and hard work. Even in the face of divine providence, humor, often dry and sarcastic, also plays a crucial role. Sharing a knowing glance or a quiet joke with a neighbor about the bailiff's greed or the perpetually muddy fields provides a vital emotional release. It's a way of asserting a tiny bit of agency, a psychological victory over forces that seek to dominate you. These moments of shared levity are pockets of mental respite, allowing you to briefly step outside the gravity of your situation. Historians still argue whether the apparent fatalism of medieval peasants led to a lack of innovation, or if it was a necessary coping mechanism that allowed them to survive in a world with limited control over their circumstances. Community provides immense psychological support, knowing that your struggles are shared, that your neighbors face the same anxieties and challenges, fosters a sense of solidarity that prevents total isolation and despair. The communal rituals, the shared celebrations, and the mutual aid we discussed earlier are not just practical necessities, they are profound psychological anchors, reminding you that you are not alone in your struggle as you lie down on your straw bed at the end of another arduous day. Your body may ache, but your mind, though weary, remains unbroken. You have faced down hunger, survived illness, and endured the demands of power. Your mental fortitude isn't celebrated in grand epics, but it is the silent, unyielding force that allows you, and generations of peasants before and after you, to persist, to hope, and to continue the endless work of survival. It is the invisible strength that ensures the very continuation of human society. Despite the daily struggles, the constant gnawing of hunger, and the omnipresent threat of disease, your life as a medieval peasant is fundamentally driven by a powerful, enduring force, hope in the next generation. Children are not just additional mouths to feed, they are the future, the continuation of your lineage, and the embodiment of your silent aspirations for a better, or at least continued, existence. Imagine looking at your small child, perhaps covered in mud from playing near the pigsty, or intently watching you sow seeds. In their innocent eyes, you see not just a reflection of your own toil, but a profound investment. They represent the continuation of your family's labor force, the hands that will work the land after you are gone. This focus on the next generation, ensuring the survival and continuity of the family unit, is a mainstream historical fact, fundamental to peasant societies across time. Without children, your family name and your ability to work your small plot of land would simply vanish. The high rates of infant and child mortality mean that every surviving child is a precious miracle. You celebrate their small milestones with a quiet gratitude, knowing how many others don't make it to their first, 5th, or 10th birthdays. You teach them everything you know, how to identify edible plants, how to mend a tool, the rhythms of the seasons, the unwritten rules of the manor. This informal, practical education is vital. equipping them with the skills necessary to navigate the harsh realities of their world. A quirky tidbit is that children were often given very practical, utilitarian names in medieval villages, sometimes reflecting their birth order, or a favoured saint, but rarely anything fanciful, indicating their immediate role within the family and community structure. Your hopes for your children are simple, yet profound. You don't dream of them becoming knights or scholars, you dream of them surviving. You hope they will be strong enough to work the land, wise enough to avoid unnecessary trouble with the Lord, and fortunate enough to find a good spouse who will contribute to the family's welfare. You might also hold a quiet hope that they will face slightly less hardship than you have, that perhaps the next harvest will be better, or the Lord a little less demanding. Historians still argue whether the high value placed on children in medieval peasant families was purely an economic necessity due to their labour, or if there was a deep emotional bond and familial love that transcended the practical considerations. For you, it's likely both. The cyclical nature of peasant life reinforces this emphasis on the next generation. You understand that your life is part of a larger, unending cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and renewal. Your children are the living embodiment of that renewal, the proof that life continues. Even after plagues and famines sweep through, their laughter, their small triumphs, and their very presence offer a powerful antidote to the ever-present despair. As you watch your child mimic your movements in the field, or carefully tend to a small fire, you feel a deep, quiet sense of purpose. Your struggles are not just for yourself, they are for them. They are the living legacy of your perseverance, the inheritors of your hard-won knowledge, and the keepers of the flame of your family's survival. In their small hands and hopeful eyes rests the future, a quiet promise in a loud, difficult world. Looking back at the centuries of your medieval existence, from the gnawing hunger of famine to the terrifying onslaught of plague and the constant burden of the Lord, one overarching principle defines your remarkable persistence: survival through adaptation. You, the medieval peasant, were not a static figure. You were a master of flexibility and resourcefulness, constantly adjusting to the unpredictable and often brutal realities of your world. Imagine the constant need to pivot. A spring frost kills your early crops. You adapt by immediately planting a hardier and late-season grain, hoping to salvage something. The Lord demands an extra day of labor. You adapt by working longer hours on your own plot, perhaps enlisting the aid of your children, pushing yourselves to exhaustion. The plague sweeps through, decimating your village. You adapt by taking on the vacant strips of land, or perhaps by daring to move to a town where labor is desperately needed. This continuous process of adaptation, often incremental and unheralded, is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the dynamic nature of peasant life despite its apparent rigidity. This adaptability wasn't just about responding to crises, it was about squeezing every possible advantage from your environment and your social structure. You learned which plants could be foraged, which wild animals could be snared without attracting the Lord's wrath, and how to stretch a handful of grain into a meager meal. You cultivated diverse crops, not just a single cash crop, to spread the risk of failure. If wheat failed, perhaps the oats would survive. This diversified approach to subsistence farming was a crucial form of adaptation. A quirky tidbit is that medieval peasants often developed complex customary laws and informal agreements within their villages for managing shared resources like common lands, fallow rotations, and water rights, constantly adapting these rules to local conditions and communal needs, often without the direct intervention of the Lord. Your resourcefulness extended to every aspect of your life. You repaired tools with whatever materials were at hand, mended your threadbare clothes until they were patches upon patches, and built your homes from the earth itself. Waste was an alien concept. Every scrap, every bit of animal dung, every fallen branch had a purpose. You found ways to make the most of what little you had, turning scarcity into a brutal kind of ingenuity. Historians still argue whether this constant need for adaptation fostered a collective, conservative mindset focused on risk aversion, or if it secretly nurtured a spirit of quiet innovation and individual agency within the confines of a feudal system. The ability to adapt was also psychological. You learned to live with chronic uncertainty, to find moments of joy amidst hardship, and to develop an almost superhuman patience. You understood that control was an illusion, and that resilience lay in bending rather than breaking. This mental flexibility was as crucial as your physical strength in enduring the long centuries of the medieval period. As you look back on the long and hard journey of your life, you realize that your survival isn't a fluke. It's a testament to an unending series of adaptations, large and small, conscious and unconscious. You are a living example of human tenacity, a silent master of making do, of finding a way forward even when every path seems blocked. Your survival isn't about grand victories or heroic tales, it's about the quiet, relentless, and profoundly powerful act of simply continuing, day after day, year after year, through every imaginable hardship, having witnessed the incredible flexibility and resilience that allowed you to adapt to relentless hardships. It becomes clear that the story of the medieval peasant is ultimately one of the enduring spirit. This isn't a grand, romanticized notion, but a testament to the quiet, unyielding strength of ordinary people who, despite overwhelming odds, simply refused to be extinguished. Imagine the endless cycle. Dawn breaks, you're in the fields, dusk falls, you return to your hovel, the seasons change, the work changes, but the struggle remains constant. Yet, within this monotony, there's a flicker, a stubborn refusal to yield, this quiet persistence, the sheer determination to live and to see your family live, is a fundamental aspect of the human experience and a profound mainstream historical fact for the vast majority of people throughout the medieval era. Your spirit is not defined by rebellion, but by unwavering, day-to-day resilience. This enduring spirit manifests in countless ways. It's in the calloused hands that continue to till the soil, even after a ruined harvest. It's in the eyes that watch a loved one succumb to illness, yet still find the strength to care for the living. It's in the shared laughter over a simple joke by the fire, a brief, defiant moment of joy amidst hardship. It's the ability to find meaning and purpose in the smallest of things, the first green shoot of spring, a healthy calf, a clear night sky full of stars. Consider the role of faith. Even when the church seemed to demand so much, it also offered solace, a framework for understanding suffering, and the promise of a better afterlife. This spiritual resilience, the belief in a higher purpose or a benevolent divine plan, however obscure, provided a powerful anchor in a chaotic world. It allowed you to accept hardship not as arbitrary cruelty, but as a test of faith, a path to salvation. A quirky tidbit is the prevalence of folk magic alongside formal religious practice, charms for good harvests, amulets against illness, whispered blessings for animals. These seemingly contradictory practices actually highlight the desperate, multifaceted ways your enduring spirit sought control and comfort in an uncontrollable world. The enduring spirit is also rooted in community. The shared burdens, the mutual aid, the collective celebrations, and the simple presence of your neighbors create a powerful psychological buffer against despair. You are not alone in your struggle. And that shared experience fosters a strength that transcends individual hardship. You draw courage from each other, a silent pact to continue, no matter what. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism of medieval peasants was a sign of resignation to their fate or a profound demonstration of inner strength and a sophisticated coping mechanism for an unpredictable existence. As you stand on the cusp of another day, the sun barely piercing the morning mist, the challenges ahead are clear, but so too is the quiet strength within you. It's not the strength of a knight's arm or a lord's decree, it's the quiet, persistent strength of survival, of hope, and of an unyielding commitment to life itself. This enduring spirit, passed down through countless generations, is the true, unsung legacy of the medieval peasant, a testament to the unbreakability of the human will. As the echoes of your own struggles fade, you begin to perceive the profound, often overlooked, impact of lives like yours. The story of the medieval peasant is far more than just a tale of survival. It is the legacy of the unsung, the bedrock upon which modern society would eventually be built. While kings and queens fill the history books, it was the anonymous toil of millions like you that truly shaped the future. Imagine the sheer scale of their contribution for centuries. You and your ancestors were the literal foundation of medieval society. You fed everyone, the lord, the knight, the priest, the burgeoning townspeople. Without your relentless labor in the fields, producing the food that sustained all, no armies could march, no cathedrals could be built, no trade routes could flourish. This fundamental economic contribution of the peasantry is a mainstream historical fact. Though often overshadowed by narratives of power and conflict, you were the silent engine of an entire civilization. Beyond sustenance, your quiet perseverance helped maintain continuity through periods of immense upheaval. When empires crumbled, when plagues swept through, when wars ravaged the land. It was often the enduring resilience of the peasant population that ensured the very fabric of society did not completely unravel. You remained on the land, planting, harvesting, and rebuilding. Even when the world around you seemed to fall apart, you were the constant in a world of flux. Consider the innovations, however small, that emerged from your practical, on-the-ground experience, the understanding of crop rotation, the improvements in ploughs, the development of common land management. These weren't conceived in ivory towers, but often adapted and refined through the collective wisdom of generations of peasants. These incremental advances, born of necessity and observation, slowly but surely increased agricultural productivity, laying the groundwork for future population growth and economic development. A quirky tidbit is that many of the traditional folk songs and stories that we glimpse from medieval Europe, often focusing on nature, community, and the struggles of everyday life, were composed and passed down orally by peasants, forming a rich, if often unwritten, cultural legacy. The gradual decline of serfdom, accelerated by events like the Black Death, was not just an economic shift, it was a profound social transformation that you, through your persistent quest for better terms and greater freedom, helped to drive. Your movement to towns, your demands for commutation, and even your desperate revolts chipped away at the feudal system, paving the way for a society with greater personal liberty and a more fluid social structure. Historians still argue whether the lasting legacy of the medieval peasant is primarily one of enduring suffering and exploitation, or if their quiet resistance and adaptability ultimately laid the groundwork for the more egalitarian societies that would emerge in later centuries. As you reflect on the vast, anonymous tapestry of medieval lives, you realize that your story is not just your own. It is the story of how humanity, through sheer tenacity and an unbreakable spirit, navigated some of its darkest ages. It is the legacy of perseverance, of making do, of nurturing life against overwhelming odds. The towering castles and magnificent cathedrals may capture the eye, but it is the invisible, unceasing labor of the unsung peasant that built the foundation for everything that came after. Your life, however humble, has left an indelible mark on the very course of history. As the long journey through the medieval peasant's life draws to a close, from the daily grind in the muddy fields to the terrifying spectre of plague and famine, we arrive at a final reflection, reflections on resilience. Your story, the story of countless anonymous lives, isn't just a historical account, it's a profound testament to the enduring capacity of humanity to persist, to adapt, and to find meaning even in the most unforgiving circumstances. Imagine taking a deep breath, perhaps a sigh of relief, as the burdens of the medieval world begin to recede. You've witnessed firsthand the sheer tenacity required to survive. It's a resilience born not of grand strategies or heroic acts, but of quiet, stubborn perseverance. It's the ability to plant seeds year after year, even when harvests fail. It's the strength to rebuild after fire or flood. It's the courage to nurse a loved one through sickness, even when you know death is likely. This unwavering human resilience in the face of adversity is not just a historical observation, it's a fundamental truth that transcends time and circumstances, a mainstream historical fact that resonates even today. Consider the interplay of external pressures and internal strength. The feudal system was designed to bind you, to extract your labor and resources. Nature, through climate change and disease, often conspired against you. Yet, you found ways to carve out an existence. You learned to live with scarcity, to find sustenance in unexpected places, and to transform despair into determination, your ability to adapt, to innovate in small ways, and to leverage the occasional shift in power dynamics, like after the Black Death, shows a pragmatism and ingenuity that is deeply admirable. The role of community cannot be overstated in this resilience. Your village, with its communal bonds and mutual aid, was an essential buffer against complete collapse. The shared labor, the collective celebrations, the comforting presence of neighbors, these were not mere pleasantries, they were vital survival mechanisms. In times of crisis, the strength of the group often surpassed the fragility of the individual. This deep-rooted communalism, often born of necessity, fostered a collective resilience that allowed entire societies to endure seemingly insurmountable challenges. A quirky tidbit is how often medieval folklore and proverbs emphasized resilience and hard work, like, when bale is hexed, boat is next. When sorrow is greatest, help is nearest, reflecting a cultural embeddedness of hope even in dire times. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant's life was primarily characterized by continuous suffering and oppression, or if their agency, adaptability, and resilience demonstrate a more nuanced picture of survival and subtle progress. Perhaps it's both. The suffering was undeniable, but so was the incredible strength shown in overcoming it. Your journey reveals that even when control over your own destiny seems minimal, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself, to seek moments of joy, and to ensure continuity. As the sun sets on this historical journey, casting long shadows across forgotten fields, remember the quiet dignity of the medieval peasant. Their lives were hard, their struggles immense, but their spirit was unyielding. They built the foundations of the world we now inhabit, not with grand pronouncements, but with every seed sown, every furrow ploughed, and every breath taken in defiance of overwhelming odds. Their resilience is a timeless lesson, a quiet whisper across the centuries, reminding us of the fundamental human capacity to endure, to hope, and to find light even in the deepest darkness. Now, as the echoes of medieval fields and forgotten lives soften, let your own world slow its pace. The images of struggle, of endurance, begin to blur, replaced by a gentle calm. Feel the stillness settle around you, wrapping you in a comforting quiet. The weight of history lifts, leaving only the soft hum of the night, a gentle reminder that even the deepest darkness eventually gives way to peace. Let your mind drift, softened by the stories of those who persevered, knowing that rest is a profound form of resilience. Feel your breathing deepen, your body relax, as the edge of wakefulness gently gives way to the vast, comforting expanse of sleep. Let go of every thought, every lingering concern, and simply float into the calm. End of script. Sweet dreams.